Hello, friends. Welcome to The Reversion. I'm Anthony Westgate. I think you may all know the guy to my, I guess to my left. I'm not sure. It depends where you're looking. We've got Dr. David Patrick Harry. It's been kind of overdue that I've had him join us here. So I'm very excited to have him on. It's an honor to have him here. In case you don't know who David Patrick Harry is, he is a scholar of religion and philosophy whose research and public work explore the intersection of metaphysics, theology, and cultural critique. He just received a doctorate in religious studies and specializes in the theological analysis of modern ideological and technological movements, particularly transhumanism, which we're here to talk about this evening. And he also covers post-secular thought through the interpretive lens of classical Christian theology and Eastern Orthodoxy. I read that from the back of his newly published book, Return to Babylon, From Adam to Antichrist, which I'm holding here in my hand, or he is holding in his hand as well. There's the beautiful hard copy. And, I just received this on my doorstep when I came back from liturgy on Sunday and did a good amount of reading. I think I got the first 120 pages read in a couple sittings. So, I was, very engaging work. And as you guys may know, our research really intersects a lot on this subject. So, I'm excited to kind of share some of the knowledge that we've received from this study. And I'll just kind of hand it off to David Patrick Harry here. Basically, I'll start this off with saying that, first of all, congrats on publishing this book. It's not easy to publish a book. I'm in the process of writing one myself, and it's really overwhelming just having to write it and come up with the structure and how to present everything. And I also wanted to thank you for covering my work on one of your recent live streams. I know it was a sponsored stream, and I forget the guy's name, but he wanted you to cover the articles that I did that relates to this research. Mm-hmm. And, you went through both of them in their entirety. So I really appreciate that because it, gave it more coverage since the articles are paywalled. I was really excited to have this chat with you here. And I basically, I'll hand this off to you here, but I realized in this research that it's very obvious the direction that this all is going in. And what I'm talking about specifically is, let's say 16th century, 17th century millenarianism. Mm-hmm. It's very obvious to see by that point the direction that this is all going in. And so I very much saw a present theme of technology, scientific advancement, enlightenment. And so I'll kind of like hand it off to you there because, that's where I think the direction that we're going in our research starts to go towards a different kind of thesis, I guess.
Yeah. So this project is actually the second project. So I did a whole prep work to do a dissertation on looking at the history of psychedelic drugs and their use within a religious context and try to make the argument that they are a new religious movement. And so my specialty is I like to use, so every scholar has a method. I like to use the method of intellectual history and really try to trace ideas through cultural movements and different historical contexts. And it was advised by some of the scholars and professors that I was working with that I wrote a little excerpt about how psychedelics related to technology and mentioned like Terence McKenna and Leary and some of that stuff, Huxley. And they're like, well, I think that's a little bit more interesting. And so the field of my research is in Western esotericism, new religious movements. Those are technically the areas that my doctorate are in. So trying to find a topic that connected with the history of Western esoteric ideas and Western esotericism and new religious movements, I created a new project, and that was to look at transhumanism and define that as a new religious movement. And so I really did not know where all this research was going to go. I knew kind of what I wanted to do, and I wanted to provide a historical analysis of how the West came to the belief that we could merge with machines and attain immortality, omniscience, all these sort of categories we associate with God and divinity. And that took me to reading hundreds of books. And the first chapter that you're mentioning is tracing this, what I define as techno-millenarianism, this idea that technology is going to redeem us back to prelapsarian man, which is a theological term for Adam before the fall. And so prelapsarian perfection began to take on a theological framework regarding the advancement of what John Scotus Regina referred to as the mechanical arts. And so I begin that chapter by highlighting first how were the classifications of knowledge in the ancient period. Because when you look at somebody like Plato and Aristotle, they did not deem the material arts or the technological arts or science itself as the end all be all of knowledge. They actually preferred um, understanding the philosophical origins, the more abstract understanding. And so it isn't until a later classification by John Scotus Regina, and this all happened during the Carolingian Renaissance. So anybody who's familiar with their history, the Carolingian Empire, Charlemagne, his pact with the Pope, the Holy Roman Empire, that that pact between Charlemagne and the Pope begins in the year 800. So the 800s or the ninth century is this reigning of the Carolingian Empire as the dominant force within European culture. And John Scotus Regina, who was an Irish Neoplatonist Christian philosopher, was the only man in the Carolingian court that could translate and read both Greek and Latin. And so he was actually introduced to people like St. Maximus the Confessor, the Cappadocian Fathers, um, Dionysius the Areopagite, and a lot of the apophatic and the mystical theology of the East. And so, within all this, and then seeing this mass, what is referred to as a sort of industrial revolution, or what is referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance, like the plow, water milling, tanning, all these different things were sword production. We're taking on new abilities. Technology was being used to create these things. And John Scotus Regina is the first man in this history. So by the mid 1800s, we're talking about around 1860, 1870, he argues that technology is actually blessed from God, and that through technological advancement, man will return back to prelapsarian perfection, and that essentially the mechanical arts were going to redeem in us everything that was lost spiritually. So, full knowledge of creation, immortality, omniscience. The idea was that we are going to go back to who Adam was through technological advancement. And that idea then influences Hugh of St. Victor. It then influences Roger Bacon, who is also tied with these millenarian prophecies of a gentleman called Giacomo Fiore. And I put in the book that the prophecies of Giacomo Fiore, most of us probably haven't heard of them. I know you have because of some of your research. Most people probably haven't heard of him, but I cite that scholars actually believe, and one in particular, that Giacomo Fiore's prophecies, which was a dispensational understanding that history occurs in three stages, that the age of the Father was the Old Testament, Christ, the age of the Son is Christ, to his time at the end of the 1100s, so the end of the 12th century. And he was arguing that in the next 70 years, we're going to enter into the age of the Holy Spirit, where the authority of the church no longer matters. It's about inward spirituality. It's about your own reading of scripture, a la the sort of proto-Protestantism, right? The age of the Holy Spirit is the age of illuminated men that sort of come to their own conclusions in their relationship with God. And this millenarian fever that he set forth influenced Europe, um, really all the way to Marx. I mean, Marx himself and his material dialectic and the incorporation of Hegel is another utopian framework that's built on this sort of millenarian promise that we just have to do these things and then we'll reach utopia. And so many people have argued that all of these sort of millenarian fervors found in European intellectual history are actually tied somehow back to Joachim Fiore's influence. And so I highlight that the Age of Discovery, Christopher Columbus, the Spanish Empire, going and colonizing South and Central America, one of the catalysts for this whole thing was this idea that they needed to spread the Christian faith, utilize the technology that God had graced with them for naval navigation, all this different stuff, so that they could then bring about the end of the world. And they believed, and even Christopher Columbus himself believed, that he was divinely chosen by God for this process, and that essentially within 150 years would be the end of the world after his discovery. And he believed that this was going to culminate in the Christians taking over the Holy Land and essentially reestablishing its dominance over Jerusalem and Mount Zion. And so all of that I say to set the stage regarding the 16th century is that in the 1400s, something that I know you're very familiar with and your work has touched on, that during the Council of Florence, the Ottomans were on the up in regards to taking over Constantinople and destroying what was left of the Byzantine Empire. Out of political necessity and economic necessity, the East then reaches over to the West, the Bishop of Rome, and they create this council, the Council of Florence, to essentially try to negotiate or a renewal and a union between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. Again, really what was driving this whole thing was politics and the necessity that the Ottomans, they needed money, they needed soldiers, they needed help to stop the Ottomans. Well, as any Orthodox Christian knows, we don't support the Council of Florence. Once the bishops came back, other than St. Mark, they were renounced by the laity, and nothing fell through. But during this council, the Eastern theologians and bishops were bringing documents that were only available in the Greek, that were only available in the Byzantine Empire, into the West to be translated into Latin. And this is where we get Plato into Latin. That's why scholasticism is an Aristotelian system of theology, because they only had Aristotle in its complete work. They didn't have Plato. So during the mid 1400s, we're talking about 1450 to 60 to 70, Marsilio Ficino is commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, who arguably is the wealthiest man in the world at that time, maybe other than the Chinese emperor. The Medici family, a lot of corruption there. Everybody's probably familiar. But they dominated the sort of mercantile commerce going through Europe, but especially in Florence. And so when we think of the Renaissance, we're thinking of this Renaissance humanism that emerges really because the Corpus Hermeticum, this book that was believed to be written by Hermes Trismegistus, which was believed to be older than the book of Genesis, right? So the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, there was this presupposition that Hermes was the oldest philosopher of humanity. And during the Renaissance, they had this classicist presupposition that the older something was, the more true it was, and that through history, through historical time, things become diminished. So this foundation then sets the basis for why you're bringing up the 16th century. I argue, and I think this is a very strong argument, many other scholars have made it, that the 16th century is the most magical century in European history. You think, what? I thought that'd be the ancient period. No, it's actually the 16th century, the 1500s, the same century in which the Protestant Reformation happens, because throughout Europe and throughout the intelligentsia, they believe that this Corpus Hermeticum, the series of magical, Neoplatonic magical framework that's presented in Hermeticism, was actually predating the Bible, and that the Bible needed to be reinterpreted through this Hermetic lens. And this is where you get the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati and some of these esoteric societies. By the 1500s, you already have speculative Freemasonry, Scottish Freemasonry in Scotland. And in the 1300s, so the 14th century, during the Islamic conquest of Spain, they actually allowed, the Umayyad Empire allowed for Jewish mystics, Christian mystics, and Muslim mystics to engage in this sort of syncretism. We know that they used opium and hashish and cannabis and things like that the Muslim mystics, the Sufis, brought together. Out of that milieu is where we get the Zohar. essentially the Jewish book on Kabbalah. And so this then has a reverberating effect, and people like Giovanni Piccadella Mirandola, Marsilio Ficino begin to promote this idea of sort of Christian magic, Christian Hermeticism. And this sets the stage for what science essentially comes out of. Now, you may be asking, how does any of this stuff relate to transhumanism? It relates to transhumanism because within all this framework, the Renaissance is diminishing revelation, and it's pushing forward humanism. And so the presuppositions begin to shift. If you're familiar with intellectual history, Descartes is around the turn. And so the rationalist schools, the empirical schools of knowledge, all this stuff begins to build a framework where God graces the Europeans through technology, and technology is going to allow them to defeat the Antichrist and the enemies of the Christian faith. By the time of the scientific revolution, so once we start getting into the mid 1600s, so like 1640 is when the Royal Society is, or 1660 is when the Royal Society is founded. So after the English Civil War, we see the reunification of England, and we see this new foundation of what we call today science. And science was built on all of this magical stuff: alchemy, Hermeticism, Kabbalah. And it's because of Bacon, Francis Bacon's turn. Sorry if I'm belaboring the point. So Francis Bacon, he creates a new utilitarian. It's called the Baconian Revolution, or Baconian science. And he then puts forth that knowledge is actually about utility. And so knowledge, this is a major transition. So I'm talking of multiple centuries here, from the ancient period to essentially the scientific revolution. But what happens is Francis Bacon specifically inaugurates this transition in knowledge, that knowledge is not about abstract understanding. It's not about mass philosophical universals. It's about doing things. And so knowledge comes from knowing something to actually doing something. It's a redefinition. And we still think of this today. These presuppositions are rooted within the Western mind. So Francis Bacon and these Baconian revolutions then revolutionize what we're doing. James, King of England, not very much interested in magic. So during that 16th century, you have people like John Dee, you have Paracelsus, you have Henry Cornelius Agrippa, you have all these occultists and these alchemists. With the redating by Isaac Casaubon in like 1613 of the Hermetic Corpus, we realize, oh no, the Hermetic Corpus was written in the 4th century. And so then all the intelligentsia, and tied with this is the 30 Years' War, the attempt to create a sort of Hermetic Protestant kingdom by Frederick the Elector Palatine. He married Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of the King of England. The King of England was not interested in all this magic stuff. In fact, he hated John Dee, who was the basis for the 007 spy. He was an occultist, developed the Enochian language, conjured demons with Edward Kelly. James actually contributed to the disgracement of John Dee later in his life, and he essentially died poor and in shame. And so he was not promoting of these magical arts, but the man who married his daughter was actually a German Palatinate. He voted for the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he believed, and was believed by the Rosicrucian movement, that he was going to bring forth a Protestant Hermetic kingdom that was going to dominate Europe, bring all of Christianity back together, gain this ancient faith, and restore us back to a millenarian utopia. And it was all tied, and this is why the Protestant North is so much more industrial than the Catholic South. It has to do with these millenarian technological presuppositions that get rooted and developed from the Reformation forward. So that was a lot there. I know you're trying to speak specifically about the 16th century, but feel free to go anywhere.
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to understand all this context to even know how they arrived at the 1600s, where all this crazy millenarian speculation was running wild. All this messianic fervor. You had. It's funny you mentioned the dates. That was one thing that really fascinated me. How you have in 1517 the Protestant Reformation, and actually even further back than that. I mean, alchemy entered Europe. It was like less than 100 years after the Great Schism. So the church schisms, and then within less than a century, alchemy enters Europe from the Arabs, brought it in
Yes.
too with the Kabbalah.
Yes.
And so then you come to 1500s and 1517, the Reformation. 200 years later, 1717, Freemasonry is basically conceived in the Constitution of Freemasonry, and then you have what happens 200 years later, 1917. It's the Balfour Declaration is signed, and the Russian Revolution is underway in the same year.
Right.
So I was like really fascinated and by these dates and how they kind of transformed, not the dates themselves, but there's these really revolutionary, transformational moments in history. I mean, even within those time frames, you have, as you mentioned, 1660, where the Royal Society is established. 6 years later, 1666, is the coming of the false messiah Sabbatai Zevi.
Yep.
Who, again, you have to know all this stuff that you just mentioned to understand why all of these Puritans went along with this Jewish messianic movement that won over half the Jewish world.
Right.
You have to understand that, like, there was a 400-year ban in England on Jews being able to reside there from getting kicked out, and then who lets them in? A Protestant collaborating with, I'm talking about Oliver Cromwell, who collaborated with Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, who was part of the Hartlib Circle. I think he spearheaded it, right? Wasn't he the leader? Yeah. And so there's, that ties into like this intelligence, because Hartlib was an intelligence asset. He was a spy basically, for a European spy.
Right.
But yeah, this all does involve technology, because this stuff wouldn't even have been able to occur if it weren't for the printing press. I mean, all these secret societies, they were established because of the cryptographic potential of the printing press.
Right.
That set the necessary preconditions for these secret societies to establish this esoteric architecture of the new world.
Right.
And secret societies themselves are a form of technology.
Yes.
They're an establishment based on social engineering and institutional control. They are built to establish this new society, to instantiate the mass dissemination of literature that they propagate through, Enlightenment philosophy, Chiliasm, and so this is, I see this as like the machinery of revolution, the technology, the dissemination of information, the pursuit of gnosis, like gathering as much knowledge as possible, which is another theme you see among all these guys. They were all obsessed with knowing everything in the world.
Yes.
Acquiring all the knowledge available.
That's a Hermetic presupposition, because in the Hermetic corpus, it says to be like God, you have to think like God. And again, I think for a lot of people, I know that you, as you just described, you're very familiar with this, but the influence of alchemy and magic. So like, for example, Roger Bacon plays a role, and he was an alchemist, but the proliferation of alchemy, and that is like 1300s, right? So to your point, the Arab influence had already seeped into Europe by that point. But what's unique about the 16th century, the 1500s, is that it was a mass belief that these things were actually true and that these things were useful. And so when we're talking about the rise of science, the Hartlib Circle, for anybody who's not familiar, was basically this circle to develop the secret college, the invisible college. If you've read Rosicrucian literature, in their three manifestos, they keep talking about how there's a invisible college of essentially the spiritually illuminated men of the world, and they're going to bring about this utopian existence. Now, their knowledge for this invisible college is very much Hermetic, Kabbalistic, but technology is tied with it, because to your point, the printing press was a revolution, right? So imagine the printing press is just before the Protestant Reformation. It's toward the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s. And just within a matter of 50 years, it goes from like a handful of printing presses to over 1,000 printing presses in Europe. And so we it's hard for us to as fully grok the mass production of books and what that allows to. I mean, essentially like the internet. It's the difference between before the internet and after the internet. It's just a different medium, but it allowed ideas to spread at such a faster rate than previously, where manuscripts were hand done. Now we have a machine that can mass produce literature, and we can then sell it and get it out into the world quicker and faster. And so with the Royal Society being founded in 1660, what this Hartlib Circle is doing is that most of these people are actually still fully engrossed into the magic. But there was now at this point towards the mid 1600s, toward the late 1600s, it had a taint to it. You didn't want to be associated as like an alchemist anymore. It came with a diminished state. So to sanitize science, they basically took the Rosicrucian structure of what they were going to do with the Invisible College and created the Royal Society, and now said, instead of all the spiritual knowledge, we're going to literally create things, and we're going to build things that are going to move us towards the utopia. And it's all built on, again, this Baconian revolution regarding that knowledge becomes about its utility. Knowledge is associated with you doing and making something, not about you sitting in a chair, philosophizing. That's more of an ancient approach towards knowledge. And so with the printing press, with the Royal Society, this then changes massively the move from a pre-modern to a modern world. So the pre-modern world, which I make the argument in the book, is that Orthodoxy is the only pre-modern option left in Christianity because of Vatican I, Vatican II. Yeah. Catholic Church really isn't pre-modern anymore. It's very much a modern institution. Protestantism, by definition, can't be pre-modern because it is coming out of this modern transition. And so modernism, built on rationalism, democracy, scientism, technological utopia, and democracy, individualism. I already said democracy and individualism. These are the 5 pillars of what we call modernity. And what it did away with was mysticism and participation. So even though we're not Hermetic, don't support Hermeticism, you can see that the Hermetic magical world, or even Kabbalah in general, is still pre-modern because it's very rooted in a sort of mystical, transcendent participation with something. Now, I think they have major errors, they're demonically influenced, but it's still a sort of pre-modern bent. And as we moved into the Royal Society, they're trying to sanctify and do away with this stuff. And this is where you get, 100 years later in the 1700s, like Auguste Comte, where their positive philosophy, where now we are going to create utopia. We are seeing massive advancement in machinery and technology and our ability to do science and investigate nature. And so this then sets the foundation for essentially where America comes in. 1776 is America. It is coming out of all of this intellectual journey. So when we look at the founding fathers as deists and Masons and all this stuff, this was so embedded in the intelligentsia of the time that if you were somebody, you would already believe these things. And to your point about the Puritans who came, Plymouth Rock, they came and brought their faith to America. Well, one of the things that is so unique is when I did a deep dive into Zionism, is that Zionism actually begins with the Puritans, because they had this belief that the Jews have to go back to the Holy Land for the end of the world to come. For Christ to come again, they got to get the Jews back to the Holy Land. Now, they did believe that they needed to convert the Jews to Christianity. They weren't like modern Christian Zionists, but that basis, what would be embedded in the Schofield Bible, actually began with the Puritans.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I argue in my work, is that this transmission began in the 17th century in a very obvious way, where you have these millenarian sects that start to emerge. There's actually a term that they gave them, restorationists. There's these like Puritan restorationists who have this notion of, we need to accelerate the conditions for the Messianic age, which is entirely Kabbalistic, by the way. Yeah. So the Jewish mystics have been doing this. They have this entire framework in Kabbalah where they believe they can actually, through human action, set the conditions for the Messianic age. And so through the infusion of studying and integrating all of this Jewish mysticism into Protestant theology, they developed that kind of telos of like we need to hasten the imminentize the eschaton. We need to hasten the conditions for this messianic age, so that the faster this happens, the sooner Christ will return. And this is why you see in 1666 there was all these apocalyptic events that occurred. There was the London fire, and then there was also what was it, a Great Plague, I think, that they just had. And so and then Sabbatai Zevi comes and he's like, oh, by the way, I'm the Messiah, I'm here. Like, you just went through, you survived the apocalypse, and now I'm here, right? So you see how this all like kind of ties in, and to your point about the book, I think we were talking a little bit about this before, but if somebody were to start reading this book and they were like, I just want to learn about transhumanism and the Orthodox perspective on transhumanism, and they're reading about all this stuff that we're talking about here in the start of the book, they might be confused. Like, what does this have to do with transhumanism? And I'll tell you that every book I have on transhumanism, it's not a lot, but let's say 5 to 10 books I have, they're all huge. They're like 500 pages. And they're similar in the way that they cover a really broad scope of human history, like within a certain, framework, like what we're talking about here, like the transmission of Western esotericism and this kind of stuff. And the first book I read like that was David Livingstone's, it's just called Transhumanism. And it starts out with, he's talking about the Rosicrucians and the Royal Society and Freemasonry. I'm like, what? I just want to learn about transhumanism. What does any of this have to do with this?
Right.
And it wasn't until much later that I realized this is all interconnected, and you have to understand this stuff, because really transhumanism is a phase in human history, and you have to understand what brought humanity to this phase. There's a lot of this esoteric underlying philosophy that has brought us to this point.
Right.
And it's appropriate that you have the Tower of Babel on the cover of your book, and it's a return to Babylon. And, you even have the subtitles from Adam to Antichrist. That's like a pretty, broad coverage. Like it's like, okay, it's just everything, like from the beginning to the end of history.
Right.
And by the way, did you have any trouble like naming the book? Because I'm having a lot of trouble with like coming up with a title for mine.
Yeah, no, I did, because the academic title I had was like The Return to Babylon, an Eastern Orthodox Critique of Deification and Modern Transhumanism, or something.
Yeah.
And that's how you title a dissertation.
Yeah.
And then I was like, gosh, I got to really, cut it down. Like, what would be a catchy title? And so I really just went with the title of the last section of the last chapter. And so the way my book is constructed, to your point, is if you're just wanting a book to tell you about transhumanism, well, I would argue that my chapter 2 is one of the most thorough investigations into like what is the paradigm of transhumanism. So I go into detail of what is their metaphysics, what is their epistemology, what is their ethics, how did they get here, what are the academic theories of post-genderism and post-secularism and all this different stuff of how it relates. So that's there. You could make, or I could make a book out of each chapter. It's very, very dense. And so chapter 1 is trying to lay the foundation of how do you get to the point in the 20th century where Julian Huxley talks about how transhumanism, he's the first one to really coin the term as we understand it today, in his one of his early 20th century books, coins the term transhumanism, is saying this is the religion of the future. And this is a religion without revelation, Allah, again, going back to the Protestants, going back to all this other stuff where we're moving away from revelation. Hegel and some of these idealists, they believe that, just like Giacomo Fiore, that the sacraments are sort of usurped now. His Hegelian dialectic believed that his philosophical understanding was actually a sort of a higher degree than Scripture itself. Even though Scripture was true, he believed things were becoming more revealed through historical time. And so you see this diminishment of revelation, the diminishment of the tradition, the diminishment of sacraments, and the mystery behind them. This is all part of our movement into modernity. So what my goal is to lay down the intellectual history to make the concrete argument that the presuppositions of transhumanism are uniquely Western, and they're uniquely rooted within Christian theology and Christian eschatology and Christian understandings of Adam and who Adam was and how technology would restore everything that was lost to the fall. So, perfect language, perfect knowledge, immortality, uh, pure union with God. All these things were then recouched and reframed in this context. So I spend probably, I think it's almost 100 pages just trying to demonstrate that all this stuff, there is an intellectual thread here. And that's what intellectual history is trying to do as a methodology, is trying to take a concept. What I'm taking is the idea that technology redeems us, saves us, and unites us with God and brings us to utopia. Find that idea and then trace it throughout history. That's what I tried to do. And then chapter 2 is all about transhumanism, basically from Julian Huxley to the present day moment to today. Neuralink, Elon Musk. Chapter 3 then goes in a totally new direction. I'm trying to lay out what orthodoxy is, because the difficulty and why there really is no book that is truly an Orthodox Christian critique of transhumanism. One is most people don't know what Orthodox Christianity teaches, and chapter 3 is just me explicating what theosis is and what the paradigm is. What is a pre-modern Christian mystical paradigm? What does the Orthodox Church believe? So I established the intellectual history of transhumanism. Then I define transhumanism in its own terms. This isn't me trying to straw man it or even really bring full critique. It's me to try and articulate it in their own terms, that if Max Moore or Nick Bostrom were to read it, they'd be like, "Oh yeah, that is what we believe. That's exactly my epistemological framework." And then I lay out theosis and demonstrate what that worldview is and why it's not Protestant and why it's not Catholic and why it's a unique thing. And that this emphasis on deification and orthodoxy, this concept of theosis, once you take that paradigm and then you compare it to the paradigm of transhumanism, which is what chapter 4 is doing, it demonstrates that transhumanism has all these Christian characteristics. It's just inverted. So it is Ray Kurzweil's singularity, and Werner Vinge was the guy that first popularized the singularity. But the singularity truly is a secularized inversion of Christian eschatology. It's a union with divinity, the machine. You get to gain immortality. You gain omniscience. Your children will undergo a sort of immaculate conception, that they'll be born through machines. They'll be born in a lab. You'll be able to perfect their genome. And so this whole thing is very much rooted within Christian history and theology. And I just found very few scholars were actually address that head on. Just like you're talking about transhumanism with Livingston, he begins with the esoteric. So he kind of begins where, I try to begin mine in the ancient period and move forward. He already begins basically in the Renaissance, and then moves forward and shows how Kabbalah and humanism and the Rosicrucians and the Illuminati, how all these things were tied with aspects and presuppositions of transhumanism. But my goal was to really present the whole story. And so chapter 4 then it's just back and forth, showing how orthodoxy is the only true legitimate critique of transhumanism, because it has the same goal. It comes from the same historical source intellectually, meaning Christendom. And when you compare them, I mean, every single aspect is sort of an inverted redefining of what it means. And so to me, it really is the last battle on why Protestants or any sort of modern Westerner, even though right now they say, I'll never get the Neuralink put in my brain. Well, unfortunately for you, many of your presuppositions that shape the way that you interpret reality are going to move you in that direction, because you don't have a paradigm or framework that actually is pre-modern, that pulls you out of the presupposition that shows, no, actually, these things aren't going to lead towards utopia. It's actually a spiritual death. But you have to have the Orthodox Imago Dei. You have to have the Orthodox understanding of theosis to even get to that point. And that's why you're seeing the Catholic Church talking about AI prophets and Protestant Christians creating AI Jesus online, where you can ask it questions and it will respond to you. Like, why is this being incorporated into Christianity? Well, ironically, transhumanism and this idea of like an all-seeing oracle, all-knowing oracle is rooted within Roger Bacon. It's rooted within Francis Bacon. It's rooted within all these different ideologies that emerge into contemporary transhumanism. Despite, you ask a transhumanist, hey, is your transhumanist theology like an inversion of Christian theosis, or does it emerge from Christianity? They'd say, oh, of course not. This is a modern, a contemporary, more modern, like a 20th century invention. And it's like, no, actually, when you look at the presuppositions of the worldview, this is something that has been antagonistic towards historical Christianity for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to follow up on that, but sure. I want to catch up. There's a couple super chats here. If you guys send any super chats, I will get to them, as I can during breaks in the conversation here. But we got ID Bro, looking forward to 2 of my favorite researchers conversing. Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate the $10 there. ID Bro. Yeah, I was looking forward to this conversation as well. Hope you're enjoying. We got Alan Wong. Let's go. Shout out to the Chinese emperor. Yeah, we got the Chinese supremacy represented in the chat there. I think that was it. But yeah, thank you guys. I appreciate the support there. I thought I had the super chats weren't working, and I was able to fix it. So following up on that, I forgot you just mentioned a lot here. This is how it's going to go, man. It's like this goes in a million directions. I mean, like, so in my work, I can relate to that because when I originally presented the articles that you read on your stream, I had to like kind of beg people for feedback because I think they were really excited just that there was anything related to this area of history from an Orthodox perspective. But I really wanted like academic feedback. Like I wanted people to actually poke at the arguments I was making, the information I presented, the way I presented it. One of the common criticisms, I guess, points of improvement that I got was that I kind of took for granted that these concepts were known to the reader. Right. I'm talking particularly about some of the esoteric concepts in Kabbalah. Such as like Tikkun Olam, Shekinah, like all these things. And so in the revisions that I'm making and the writing of my book, I'm spending the entire first part of it just breaking down these concepts and showing like what you were talking about, how this is all an inversion of orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And particularly in the Lurianic expression of Kabbalah, which was revolutionized Kabbalah and right. Another revolution in the 17th century. Right. And what he did was basically make the entire thing dialectical, like down to the ontology. So like even the Ein Sof, God himself is these two opposing forces. So you see out of all of that comes these contradictions that are in this kind of infinite tension. And it's man's role to unite those opposites. So it's like this ancient esoteric concept of the unity of opposites. I actually think that Kabbalah kind of embodies a lot of this stuff and actually kind of explains it in a way that some of the other esoteric traditions don't. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that all really helps to frame the understanding of like the millenarian objective, this like kind of Judeo-Christian, I'm using that word because it's actually a real thing that developed. Like it's not real Christianity, but it's like, I don't know what else to call this kind of Judaic influence of Christianity. You see it within there that they developed a new eschatology that involves this Kabbalistic effort to hasten the conditions for the Jewish Messiah. And this is called Tikkun Olam. So it's all this like repair of the cosmos. It's humans repairing this cosmic accident that God himself caused. This is what they believe, that God in his creative act broke creation. And because it was, like, I won't get too like esoteric about this, but there was a bug, basically. I describe it as like there was a bug in creation that like it was inevitable. God presumably foresaw it was going to happen, but it just, and this is why they say that God created evil. So God is in the Kabbalistic understanding, God is the creator of both good and evil. And then you get into like all this stuff, which I'm sure, I don't know if I didn't look it up in your book if you mentioned this, but this is what justifies antinomianism,
Hmm.
because there's this merging of good and evil to transcend the moral law.
Right.
And so the reason I'm bringing this all up is because it actually makes a lot of sense out of the direction that transhumanism is going in, where it's this merging of opposing forces. You have, Kabbalah, again, it explains kind of the influence of the transgender movement. You have this notion of the Shekinah, which is a merging of the male and female divine forces. You have like Adam Kadmon. I'm not sure. Did you mention Adam Kadmon at all in your book?
I think it comes in chapter 4. I mentioned it a little bit about their understanding of like the ideal man and the original man, because
Yeah.
it connects with this Christian understanding of a return to Adam.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they believe it's the primordial man, the perfected man that again humans kind of have to rebuild this or restore it. So it's all human. It's all human initiated redemption. So again, just all inversive to orthodoxy. But anyway, I'm saying that all because you have to kind of understand. Unfortunately, you do have to understand these esoteric concepts to really know why this was not only so influential, but it explains a lot of the moral transgressions that they did. There's a lot of these sexual themes that you see. A lot of these guys were really degenerate and had these really immoral sexual practices. It explains the utopianism, because that's the effort of man to restore the world, or to redeem the world on his own efforts, to use technology. It's all theurgic. So anyway, yeah, this is all, I think, the important thing to understand. I did have a question about, what kind of like sent you down this path? Like, did this start with you studying esoteric literature, and you kind of like got it, like realized it was going in that direction of transhumanism, or was it the other way around?
It was kind of providential. So I was not fully aware of, like I said, all this intellectual history. Chapter 1 probably took me the most time to write, because I read so if you just look at the citations, there's so many books that I went through to try to find this argument. And so I basically read everything that was on the history of technology. And I was very familiar with all the Western esotericism stuff. And like I said, that was kind of my academic specialty. And I thought psychedelics would be on par with that. Ended up changing the project, and I wasn't really sure where it was going to go. So I didn't have a full understanding. I had a general, okay, this will be kind of the origins. Here's transhumanism. Here's orthodoxy. Here's how they go together. And then create a book reading list, and then start going through all the potential sources or resources for each chapter. And it isn't until I started the research that I thought, wow, this is so providential. It literally connects with everything, like my specialties in regards to Western esoteric ideas, the history of science, new religious movements, and orthodoxy. And so it just kind of fell in my lap that this project connects with everything that I've kind of been focusing on for the last 10 to 12 years. And that wasn't the explicit intention. When I started the project, it wasn't like, oh, this is perfect. It connects with everything that I've already done. Once I started writing and doing the research, it's like little, lights began to shine in the darkness, and I could see more and more of the path and how all these things connected. And I felt, wow, it's very providential. And I felt like this was probably the project I was, God wanted me to put together. Now, I don't mean to make it sound so highfalutin that I think God chose me to write this book. That's not, I don't want to say it in those terms, but I felt like my background, my academic background, was perfect for this work. Because as I said, there is no book that specifically makes theosis and Eastern Orthodoxy as a critique against transhumanism. There's a couple articles, and I write them. They've been by Orthodox philosophers. but that's just an article or two, and they're probably 10 to 15 pages long. Maybe one was 20 pages long. So my book was 400 some pages. And no, I didn't know where this was going to go. It wasn't until I did the research and started to write it that it's like, oh man, this is and it filled in gaps that I wasn't familiar with. So the profession of the engineer, for example, is a huge part of chapter 1, because as we moved from the scientific revolution into the Enlightenment and this elevation of reason and this doing away with all the Hermetic Kabbalistic baggage, at least publicly, right? Because as I make the point, all this stuff kept going, all the Hermeticism and Kabbalah, it just was in the Masonic lodges, which were many of the same people in the Royal Society. But when they were doing their public science, they would denounce this stuff. And we have examples of other people that in private, like they're fascinated with magic and they're fascinated with Kabbalah. And so, yeah, and ultimately wasn't until doing this research and then filling in some of these gaps, I realized, wow, this is like the project that connected on so many different disparate areas of my research, like theories of religion, theories of sociology and cultural formation. I get into that regarding the post-secular argument. So post-secularism is actually a theory that's developed by Habermas. Jürgen Habermas is part of the Frankfurt School. And so this is where, again, as an academic, I'm familiar with the Frankfurt School. I'm not a huge fan of the Frankfurt School and their sort of Marxist approach to things. However, when you do like academic stuff, I mean, there's all theories are tools. And so post-secularism, Habermas argues, and Charles Taylor, too, a Canadian scholar, argues that what is now defined as the postmodern period, you could also define as the post-secular period. And the idea is that secular ideologies no longer function as paradigms totally divorced from religious sentimentality. And that essentially modern day capitalism or communism or Zionism, which is supposed to be a secular political movement, actually functions as religion. It has totalizing narratives. It typically has some type of eschatological bent. It has an existential pursuit for the people within it. And therefore, as a religious studies scholar, when you try to define something as religion, you have to say, okay, what are the sacred texts? What are the ritual formations? What is the traditions? Well, obviously, transhumanism doesn't really fit that category as easily. I mean, you can say that Kurzweil and some of these guys kind of represent prophets. They do kind of have their own sacred texts. And I make this argument in chapter 2, showing how transhumanism, yes, it fits some of the categories of religion, but it's not super precise. But if we adopt the theory of a post-secular frame, we're trying to put secular ideologies into religious categories really isn't of importance anymore, because we can see how social justice functions as a religious narrative. And that when George Floyd and the Summer of Love protests were going on, these people are getting on knees, they're bowing, like they're going through a ritual purification process. And so to me, as a scholar, it's like that post-secular ideology is a huge point for my research and for the arguments I make in the book, because I'm saying in the post-secular world, transhumanism and orthodoxy are in direct competition. Most people would say, no, what are you talking about? Transhumanism is about technology. It's about secular ideas. Orthodoxy is like that old tradition, of Eastern Christians. No, in the post-secular turn, in the post-secular world we live in, there is no delineation. And that's really where the state of philosophy is at. That's why the tag argument is so, to me, if people can understand it, it's such a strong argument, because the reason why there's a postmodern turn in the academy is that they're arguing there are no more universal narratives. There are no more, it is nominalism, as you mentioned. It's a nominal worldview where there are no universals. And if that's the case, well, then everything's on equal footing and everything is defined by the paradigm. So which paradigm do you adopt? If you're a transhumanist and you say, like I talk about, there's like Christian transhumanists and Mormonism in specific. Mormonism was the first world religion, technically a new religious movement, but the first religion to have its own transhumanist association. Now that's part and parcel of their own theology and about, how they become like God and have their own planets and all this different stuff. So it's all rooted within it. And I make the claim that I think Lincoln Cannon, he's the head of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. He says, you can be Mormon You cannot be Mormon and not be transhumanist, but you can be a transhumanist and not be Mormon. And so he argues that Mormonism as a faith is the transhumanist faith. And so from that framework, the point I'm trying to make is this delineation between secular ideologies and religion is no longer meaningful. If you adopt transhuman, I don't care if you're a Christian or a Mormon, you've already answered like questions about your paradigm, right? What do you believe in regards to epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics? And you just can't, for them, they can't get around that. So what my book is trying to do, I never mentioned tag or things like that, but it truly is looking at the post-secular period and saying, look, these are two paradigms. All ideologies are on equal footing now. There is no religion over here, democracy over here. No. It's all on equal footing, and therefore they're all in competition. What are the two leading concepts for deification? Well, it's Orthodox theosis and it's transhumanism. And that's like one of the biggest questions for humanity is what is our purpose and can we be deified? And I would argue that these two ideologies are now in direct competition for the minds and hearts of people.
And what do you think it is about, again, I only read the first, let's say, 100 pages. So that's kind of the framework I'm working within in the understanding of your book. But, one thing I noticed, and because this does intersect with my studies, and I'm really, by the way, I'm really glad that you published this book because that relieves me of the burden I was feeling of having to go in yet another direction, which would really confuse my thesis because I kept seeing all this stuff that you saw of these themes of transhumanism, of technological advancement, and how important this all is, and the apocalypse, the end of the age that they're trying to manufacture, and so I'm really glad because that kind of dismisses me from that feeling that I was having of like, oh, do I bring more technology into this? But all that to say, like I did notice this is, I think, from what I gathered, the primary kind of intersection that you were getting at with the techno-millenarianism. And, you did make mention of like these kind of proto-Christian Zionists in the 17th century that emerged from the millenarian movements. What do you think it is about that theme that you see of like throughout history from that point on, basically, of these guys, these utopian types that are really into science and technological advancement and also happen to believe that the Jews should have a homeland to return to? Because they seem pretty unrelated, but like, what do you think that there's anything there in the influence that they had?
I would say that are you focusing specifically on the contemporary moment right now, or historically, like from the 17th century
historically,
forward?
like how these guys all kind of started reinterpreting the Bible and developed this new eschatology that seemingly, all involved the return of the Jews to their homeland.
Right.
And this, by the way, you even touched on this earlier, that it wasn't even a necessarily like philo-Semitic view that they had. In fact, a lot of these guys were deemed anti-Semitic by their critics.
Right. Yeah, they believed that Judaism was the wrong religion. They just believed, really getting with these Puritans, that they needed to send the Jews back to the homeland, back to Israel, or what again it was Palestine, back to Palestine, back to the Holy Land, and then they needed to convert. Right. So they again, the Puritans kind of put this forward, but they weren't like contemporary Protestant Zionists that think that they're still the chosen people. No, they were still like, no. They, Judaism's wrong. They got to convert. But they were filled with this eschatological hope. Right. And so when you're talking about techno-millenarianism from before the Protestant Reformation, this was all inspired by Giacomo Fiore in this dispensational three ages. And it enraptured so much. I mean, Luther he read Joachim. And so many of the reformers, the Protestant reformers, believed that what they were doing was breaking from the wrongdoings of the Catholic Church and setting the stage for God's will to be done to create this utopian scenario. And so I would argue that Protestantism is already built on a sort of utopianism that isn't necessarily found in the Orthodox Church. Now, we do believe in a utopian after the second coming, but Jay's referred to that as a form of post-millennialism. Typically, we describe our eschatology as amillennial, that it's both happening and yet completed. It's part of the both and framework of orthodoxy. So we are an amillennial. You could refer to our understanding of the second coming as a form of post-millennial, but not in the same Protestant understanding where, they needed to create these machines. They needed to create this utopia. And so when you're talking about Zionism, I think the influence is that these Protestants are trying to figure out, how do we deal with the coming of the end times? And because of the Puritan influence, this gets going, further and further and further and further, and adds more layers to it. But it's because the Protestants are so anxious. One, they don't have a mystical worldview. It's more of an ideology. And then they're trying to deal with these ultimate questions of historic time. And because the influence of the Puritans, I think Zionism is now just part and parcel. Whether you're Orthodox or not, you can no longer talk about eschatology without talking about Israel, because of the Radio Israel Project, because of who we understand the Antichrist to be, and Tel Aviv's involvement in Silicon Valley and the creation of these AIs. Like the Jewish state is not opposed to transhumanism. Like there is no theological, maybe for some individuals, but at large, many of them are in favor of it. So like Yuval Noah Harari plays a central place in my book regarding his work Homo Deus, where it's explicitly a transhumanist work. Yeah. He's explicitly in favor of it. He teaches at the university in Jerusalem. He is a proud Israeli. Now, does he represent all Israelis? No, probably not. But in the moment of today, I would argue that there's just so many Jewish individuals that is involved in the transhumanist project and in the development of these technologies, that because of their ethnic, sometimes religious, mostly an ethnic identity, that they still cling on to the promises of greater Israel and Israel's prestige in the world. So I think as a historical phenomenon, it began with these Protestants trying to figure out how are they going to articulate the end times. And it began with Jews just have to get to the homeland, and then we're going to convert them to Christianity. Eventually that gets morphed to where you get Christian Zionism. But now when you look at Palantir, who runs Palantir? Alex Karp, Peter Thiel, Elon. Are these people like anti-Zionist? No, they're almost all Zionist. So there's this interesting correlation between now many of the movers and shakers in the transhumanist project are in one way or not affiliated with Israel. And I think that plays a huge, huge factor in it. So it moved from figuring out eschatology to now look just who's involved with all the projects.
Yeah. And this was like one of the things I was mentioning earlier that I had to like really kind of prevent going down this path, because it would have just taken me into the territory that you're in. Then it's like a whole other thesis basically. But, I just was seeing all these quotes from prominent Zionist thinkers, even like kind of what I would consider like proto-Zionist rabbis and things like that, who were talking about how important the role of technology plays in advancing tikkun, the world repair. Right. And then, I came across these articles of these Israeli journalists that were writing about new Zionism, which involves this kind of like techno-utopia in Israel, and establishing this like kind of like superior, like you said, almost Silicon Valley of the world. Mm-hmm. You look at how influential they are with establishing all this spy technology, surveillance tech. I mean, they're really kind of like at the forefront of all that.
Right.
So, I think that it's undeniable that plays a huge role. And it's just real, again, this is why it's really important to understand the transmission of this history and how this came about. Like it didn't just like, this isn't all like by coincidence like that. No. It's like all these guys are just into tech. They just really love it. This is like part of their eschatology. It's part of their eschatology. And whether, again, like you said, whether they're religious or not.
Right.
My kind of theory about that, I wouldn't be able to substantiate this, is that particularly with like Judaism, secular Jews, is that they're never so far removed from their religious tradition that it's like it separates them from having a new metaphysics or a different kind of presupposition. So like even the secular Jews that are involved in this project, they're still kind of to some degree operating under that understanding that they have the power to reshape the material world.
Right. Right. Yeah. And, for anybody that's dealing with any of these esoteric traditions, it's a form of gnosis. It's a form of Luciferian power. And for them, maybe in their heart, they think they're going to help humanity. Okay, whether they do or not, they see technology as an extension of their will, and it does. I mean, it's a multiplier effect, right? So, why would people who have a Jewish eschatological understanding of the coming of their Messiah be so interested in all the technological surveillance and financial monitoring, all this different social media posts? Well, for them, it's going to allow them to control, a power structure more readily. It's going to be able to implement potential Noahide laws.
Yep.
It's going to allow them to gain a sort of Tower of Babel and be at the top of it. And so, depending on, I don't want to get too controversial for any of the TOS or anything like that, but
I kind of already went there at this point. I think I've tested the limits on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, in 2025, it's a new day.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I started on here. I was like, oh, I guess they've loosened up with the TOS on YouTube. You can get away with a little more.
They certainly have. I've seen it with a few of my video titles. Things that got flagged previously, mentioning Israel or something. Now it's like they kind of slide by.
Monetize
So
it now.
I know for a fact things I posted 3 years ago are no longer being tagged by the algorithm now. So I don't know what that means, but there is a sort of loosening of the Overton window right now. And so, my running thesis and the argument that I make in the book is from an Orthodox Christian perspective, technology can't be evil in and of itself. It doesn't have a will, but the implementation of one's will through technology can absolutely be evil. And I highlight all these different clerics in chapter 4, metropolitans, patriarchs, saints, talking about how technology will be a network that could ensnare and entrap humanity, and that their whole transition and fusion with the machine is the annihilation of the Imago Dei. It's the annihilation of free will. I mean, there's all these research, from Jose Delgado. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. I have a book where he did all these experiments in the 1950s in America and in places like Mississippi and Louisiana at these hospitals where they put electrodes into people's brains. And they did experiments to see if they could control them, what they could do. Like one woman, they put one in the center of her brain that would allow them to have perpetual orgasm. They put it in children to see if they could manipulate behavior. These were like orphan children. I mean, a lot of scary stuff, but his research culminated in putting an electrode in a bowl and being able to manipulate it. So they would do the red flag, the bowl would charge, and then they could hit a button and then like basically daze him, and it became totally docile. And so this research was in the 1950s. Now, just think of where we're going into the future. And if you do fuse with the machine, if you do take the electrodes, how much free will do you have? Especially with an AI system behind it that could insert various inputs into your brain or stimulate various centers, you're going to lose your autonomy. And in that sense, it truly is a sort of demonic henosis. Henosis is a term used in Neoplatonism because about the full unification with the one, right? We talk about theosis, unification with the persons of God. Apotheosis is about you becoming God, right? And I'm arguing that the apotheosis of transhumanism is a form of material henosis. So they're not Neoplatonic in the sense that they're so interested in metaphysics, but they're going to unite everything into the
technological there's the merging of opposites again.
Right. Yeah. So it's still a monism, right? And most people don't think that. They think transhumanism. I'm arguing, no. This is a material form of Neoplatonic monism. It takes a little, you have to know what the words mean and what's going on here. But I think that's actually the case. And so just like how orthodoxy preserves the distinction through theosis, we enter into the kingdom, we still preserve our personhood made in the image, and we still unite with the persons of God and attain a sort of eternal transcendence. Transhumanism is saying, yeah, okay, we'll give you transcendence. You're just going to merge in this material technocratic cybernetic system. And then once you're in there, I mean, are you really you? Do you really have free will? I don't think you do. And if it nullifies free will, and there's multiple things that it nullifies, but if it just nullifies that, it's already directly in opposition to what Christianity understands as the telos of mankind. So anybody who wants control, anybody who's interested in like this worship of self, I think then that's ultimately what it comes down to. Is it doesn't matter if I argue, and that's where Hermeticism comes in. I bring up the Asclepius. The Asclepius is a book within the Hermetic corpus that talks about indwelling statues with demons from our perspective, but they spell it as daemons, sort of an intelligent spirit. Well, I believe that to be true, and
St. Augustine mentioned that actually. That's one of the only references we have from a church father talking about Hermes Trismegistus or Hermeticism. He talks about how the demons were actually embodying these statues,
yes,
and animating them.
Yes.
And you see throughout the lives of the saints that they're casting demons out of these pagan statues with the sign of the cross.
Exactly. Right. But how many modern Christians even think that that's real?
Yeah.
Yeah. From an Orthodox perspective, we absolutely think that's real. And so my whole point then with transhumanism or with we're in an AI race right now. It's kind of like the Manhattan Project, and we're racing China and Russia and the Middle Eastern nations. And then there's like 4 or 5 companies in the United States racing with each other. And this race is to get the most powerful AI, what they believe will become AGI, artificial general intelligence. And once they get that, I mean, it will be able to dissemble or navigate around all the other AIs. And so this whole pursuit is about total control of the world, total control of the population. And if you worship yourself, you're already going to be part and parcel of, I would argue, this demonic trajectory. And so we do believe you can enshrine, if you can put a demon in a statue, can you put a demon in the AI system? And that's what I'm kind of arguing. I don't make it as explicit, but if Satan is an entity, and that somebody could do a ritual, and this is actually something that is true about Silicon Valley. There's all these articles about how these guys want to quit that are working on the project. They don't quit because they're so enthralled with the advancement of the technology, but deep down they know, geez, this feels like it's going in a really dark direction.
Yeah, well, and they have their own like Bohemian Grove essentially with Burning Man now. It's like they all have this like occult ritual that they attend to go on these vision quests and get all these innovative ideas that they come back with. So, there's definitely, as I'm sure you're aware of, a huge intersection with psychedelics there as well. Yeah.
Right. And so if you can enshrine a statue with a demon, could somebody who is actually knowledgeable about the occult and a full practitioner, could they do a ritual to indwell an AI system with Satan or with a demon himself, thereby giving Satan powers that he doesn't have, right? We don't believe he's omniscient. We don't believe that he's omnipresent. And he's going to be doomed to hellfire eventually. So he's not even fully, immortal in that sense. But my point is, if Satan were to inhabit a sort of transhumanist hub or the AI that controls all things, Satan would be omniscient. He would know what's going on in Rio de Janeiro and Beijing at the exact same moment. He would know what's in your bank account and what you just searched on web. He would, in a sense, gain the powers that God already has by nature, but through this Babylonian, this return to Babylon structure, these structures that are made by man. And that's where, again, Satan can't create, the demons can't create, they have to get us to do it. And so I would argue that even though some people say they're inspired by, good intentions, and I would assume for many of them they are, ultimately what they're moving towards, I would say is a project inspired by dark spirits. that are going to allow a full control of humanity and augmentation of who we are and what we are. And that's why Peter Thiel, when he's asked, well, do you want humanity to persist, takes like a 10, 12-second pause. Like, what? You have
Yeah, yeah.
to
What are you
think
thinking
about
about,
whether you
bro?
want
Yeah,
humanity to persist.
yeah, yeah. You had to think about that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you were mentioning uh, Francis Bacon and John Dee, and Francis Yates actually mentioned something, and I think it's in the in Giordano Bruno book. Was it the esoteric tradition?
Mhm.
That these two figures were basically responsible in their own way of reshaping the new world.
Yeah.
And so John Dee, in the sense that he created the magical precedents to establish this kind of like Protestant hegemony,
Yes.
and then Francis Bacon created the architecture of it by establishing the idea for this invisible college that was that was basically brought to reality by the Rosicrucians and the Royal Society, who established these secret societies. And I see that as like the middle phase in humanity to where we are now, or to where it's going, even 1,000 years down the road or whatever. Because, like I said, that was like at the onset of the printing press. And that was kind of like the transfer of knowledge. That was what you were saying earlier about this dissemination of information, the widespread dissemination. That was all done in those days through the secret societies. And
Right.
they all had this kind of presupposition of world control. Even though they weren't explicitly saying it like that, they
Right.
this is what America was built on. I know that you go
Yes.
into that as well, like how once they get to America, they already have in mind the Baconian
Yes.
utopia, that they're like,
Yes.
okay, we've made it to this new Jerusalem. Now
Yes.
it's time to establish this architecture, and it's all over DC. You just look at
Yes.
like all the symbology on our, even on our money, on the architecture of these obelisks that they have,
Right.
all the Masonic stuff, like the Washington Memorial. It's a Masonic
And,
museum,
and
like
that's why I make the point that whereas science goes off from the Royal Society forward, goes off into this sort of secular bent, all the magical stuff, the Rosicrucian stuff that you just mentioned, that's all in the Masonic lodges, right?
yeah,
So that I mean, it's not totally underground, but it goes underground. It was harder to get in a Masonic lodge, in 1776 and learn the secrets than it is in 2025. Now it's kind of just a club for guys to hang out with other guys and make some type of profession for the grand architect. But back in the day, I mean, these were very, very, and it's still today, it's serious at the higher levels, obviously. But back then, I mean, it was very serious. They believe they're on the front edge of history itself. They believe that this, deism or this general perennial Masonic understanding, like this is the leading edge of humanity. And to the point you're making, I'm going to lead into America, but you're talking about Francis Bacon. In I think it's the Rosicrucian Enlightenment by Francis Yates. I quote that book quite a few times, and I was trying to find any sort of historical connection to Francis Bacon and the Rosicrucians, but there really isn't any. Now, there's a lot of speculation. Francis Yates, she makes the argument that he was certainly informed by Rosicrucianism, but it gets back to that historical context about when King James of Scotland becomes King James the First of England. He hated magic. He hated John Dee. He was obsessed with the Revelation and the Book of Daniel, and he believed he was deciphering prophecy. This is where we get the King James Bible. This is the King James I'm talking about. He hated all this magical stuff. And so Francis Bacon, we don't have a direct connection to him in the quote unquote Rosicrucian movement. But to your point, his being the catalyst for the Hartlib Circle and what becomes the Royal Society, which really is the invisible college manifested in actual historical time. If you read his book, New Atlantis, which I mentioned multiple times in the first chapter, the book New Atlantis, written by Francis Bacon, he didn't finish it. He died before he was able to finish it, is him describing that these spiritually enlightened men, the men who know how to use science and build things, are going to move over to a country in the West, a la, I don't know if he knew of America or how much he knew of it, but many people speculate he's talking about North America. And that these sailors, the premise of the New Atlantis is that these sailors are like shipwrecked and they land on the shores, what we believe to be somewhere in North America. And they discover this civilization where everybody practices science. Everybody is some type of engineer or knows what's going on. And he's describing building refrigeration, building flying
Yeah.
automobiles.
Submarines.
Yeah. And this is, guys, this is like the end of the 1500s, 1600s. Like, this is pretty early stuff. And he's already envisioning where all of this new secular science, or this utilitarian science, what we call the Baconian revolution, where it's going to go and what it's going to create. And so once, all the Puritans and all the English settlers get to America, and I highlight that from the beginning of the Roanoke colony, America was already described as the New Jerusalem, and that this was the end point of history, and that the American, I'm talking from the first Great Revival and the second Great Revival, both millenarian projects, that they believed that America was the end point of history, and that the American was, in a sense, the new Adam, because he will no longer be confined by the historic context. He will be a person, the first man to exist outside of history. And so then you just look at the history of America and its expansion. And once it hits the West Coast, the actual geographical expansion ends. You could say Hawaii and Alaska, okay, whatever. But isn't it ironic that Silicon Valley then takes place right there in the Bay Area, right at the end point of the geological expansion? It's like this millenarian ethos and this project towards utopia that's built within the American spirit that many people are unconscious of. It's like, okay, well, we've gone everywhere on the continent. Now what's the new frontier? Well, the new frontier then is, for them it was corporations. Then it gets into, by the 60s counterculture, it's technology, it's computers. Yeah. And it's like, in the same American spirit, now secularized, it's the same promise, right? America is going to create all these technologies. America is going to spread democracy. America is going to save the world. It's the same thing. It's the same trajectory. It's the same mythos from the mid 1600s to 2025. It's just taken secular rhetoric and repackaged the same thing.
Yeah, and actually, I did find, I don't know how substantial this connection is, but I did find in my research something that might have linked Bacon to Rosicrucianism, and that is basically Johann Valentin Andre, that who I know you cover. Mm-hmm. He published the Rosicrucian manifestos. Presumably it was him that published it. It's like, I know it's debated, but there's like strong evidence that he was the one who kind of crystallized the Rosicrucian manifestos.
I believe that's the case.
Yeah.
And I make that argument in the book, and I cite Francis Yates, but I do believe that theory.
Yeah. So, and as you know, New Atlantis was published posthumously. So after Bacon had died, and so the Rosicrucian manifestos were published a few years after, and there's speculation that Andre was influenced by New Atlantis, because it was based, like you said, he materialized the invisible college. He was alive while the New Atlantis was disseminated. He would have had contact with this literature. He's from Württemberg, which was this kind of esoteric hub in Europe. I go into a lot of that in my work. You see a lot of just like with these figures, you see a lot of these locations reemerging throughout history. Right. Württemberg, by the way, is where Hegel's from. That was his birthplace.
Exactly. Yep.
And
exactly.
Also, Reuchlin was from Württemberg as well.
Yep.
So yeah, you see that there's this alchemical reform movement happening in Prague, and all these guys were traveling back and forth between these locations. So yeah, I happen to think that I realize that's not something you could actually prove academically, but I
Well, in
strongly
the
believe that there
argument,
was a connection
I,
there.
I think he was influenced by it, and I think the reason why he never made any public reference to the Rosicrucians is because of King James, and because Francis Bacon was very high in English society, and he knew the sentiments of the king and how he felt about John Dee. And so I think if he was influenced by the Rosicrucians, and some of the arguments that Yates makes for that connection is when you read the New Atlantis, there's like inscriptions on things that are RCB, which would insinuate like the Rosicrucian Brotherhood or something like that. Um, but I think he went out of his way. Some people speculate that other people covered it up after his death, that some people destroyed documents that potentially insinuated conversations he had. But we know that he engaged with people that were openly Rosicrucian. So I think he was influenced by this idea. We know that Hartlib and again those who founded the Royal Society, half of them were still interested in John Dee, but because of the English Civil War and King Charles being put on the throne, and like they said, okay, we don't discuss this stuff anymore publicly, and they made an agreement at the Royal Society. You don't talk about religion because there is tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants, and you don't bring up any of this magic stuff. We do not talk about John Dee because there is all this stuff about Paracelsus, Paracelsian magic, Paracelsian alchemy, and many of these guys, and I mentioned their names in chapter 1, like the Royal Society, they're in the early stages. This is the 1640s. They're literally building the Royal Society, and some of them are still obsessed with magic. I mean, oh geez, I'm blanking on one of the names. Um, anyways, one of the very famous English mathematicians. I'll find his name here in a second. I apologize. I'm having a brain fart. But he was still obsessed with some of John Dee's and Paracelsus's theories about nature and numbers, mathematics, how it related.
John Wilkins.
John Wilkins, but there was a I'll find it in just a second. Once I say it, I'm going to be embarrassed that I couldn't remember.
That happens to me like every single stream, literally every stream.
Robert Boyle. God.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was. But you're totally right. John Wilkins, I make the point in the book, like he had magical, weird stuff in his office, right? So John Wilkins, during the 1640s, where they're having these early meetings that will form the Royal Society, he's like interested in, he's literally writing about Paracelsian magic and John Dee's theories of numbers and its correspondence to nature. And then like 10 years later, he condemns all of it. But when people go to his office, they say, yeah, he's got all this weird magical stuff. He's got like this secret pipe that he can make statues speak. And he was fascinated with anything that was mechanical, like creating autonomous mechanical machines. And so, yeah, I think there's a major overlap between this stuff. And it's very interesting to see how all that Hermetic, Kabbalistic, Rosicrucian stuff essentially gets amalgamated into some of the speculative Freemasonry.
Yeah.
And then science takes on this new persona. I mean, it transitions in like 20 years. And now all of a sudden it's totally sanctified from all this stuff. And we use Bacon's methods for utilitarian knowledge. That is our project moving forward. And science has essentially been on that path ever since.
Yeah. And Freemasonry in particular is pivotal. That's why it's so interesting to me that it came in that kind of middle stage between the Reformation, 200 years between the Reformation and the creation of Freemasonry, where interestingly, by the way, you had all this iconoclasm occurring in the late 17th century, well into the 17th century. All this, so that's kind of symbolic of the destruction of the old world and the destruction of the icon, and then Freemasonry's ushered in, literally 200 years later, in the in between point of the Reformation and the establishment of the Russian Revolution and the Balfour Declaration that kind of like solidifies the creation of Israel. And then you look at the whole goal of Freemasonry, which is to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. And this ties into the Rosicrucian manifestos where, even I mentioned earlier, Valentin André, I think I mixed up something. It wasn't the Rosicrucian manifestos. It was his.
Christianopolis.
The description of the Republic of Christianopolis, which was playing on Bacon's Invisible College, the Solomon's House, which
Hmm.
was a secret society of, by the way, Christian. There were Christian technocrats essentially
Yes.
that were part of this secret society that were innovating, and they had all this advanced scientific knowledge. And so that just basically becomes a culmination in Freemasonry
Yes.
with this explicit objective of our mission is to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. Now, many Freemasons would say, well, that was allegorical. It's an allegorical rebuilding, but you see that in like the writings of these 33rd degree Masons. These guys like what's his name, Eliphas Levi,
Mm-hmm. Albert Pike.
Albert Pike, where they're explicitly saying that.
Yeah.
And you look at how it was developed on this notion of the Solomon's House, which is interesting that even Bacon had this notion of like, oh, we're going to call it the Solomon's House. So
Right.
it's kind of like envisioning of this utopia that's within the context of like this kind of biblical history, the rebuilding of this temple. So again, Freemasonry is a builders guild,
Yes.
and that involves like these were the engineers. These were the computer programmers of their time.
Yes. And through Freemasonry and the Royal Society, again, this sort of keeping some of the magic, doing away with the magic, what emerges in the 1700s is the profession of the engineer. Right. I
Yeah,
try to make this point explicit in the book because most people probably don't think of it. You think of, oh, an engineer, they build stuff. Yeah, that's an ancient profession. Actually, not. That's the category of the engineer, somebody who makes machines or builds these processes, these mechanical processes. That doesn't even emerge until the 1700s. And once that emerges, they are viewed as the new prophet of creation, the new priest of creation, because they can actually make things work. Therefore, they can make the new Jerusalem happen. And it's viewed in this Baconian light, and they're elevated. And so when you think of a computer engineer who is behind the entire, what I call the cybernetic skeleton of Satan, it's kind of a, tongue-in-cheek phrase, but that's what they're contributing to. They're this massive interconnecting of all things. The engineer, whether they're conscious of it or not, the profession itself has been moving steadily forward towards this progression. And I highlight that the engineer, because of all this stuff happening in the 1700s, by the time America is founded, and especially by the time of the Second Great Awakening, I mean, the engineer, bridge builders, people that built machines, they were believed to be like the frontier of society. Like they were inaugurated, and Americans believed that they were going to bring about utopia, that they were going to end history. And I bring this up with Edward Bellamy's famous book, Looking Backward. I bet a massive swath of Americans never heard of this book. I wasn't aware of this book till I did my research. Well, Edward Bellamy was this socialist, and in the late 1800s, so right before we get into the 20th century, he writes this book called Looking Backward, which was the most popular book outside of Uncle Tom's Cabin. That was the only book that sold more copies. And this book, Looking Backward, he's describing mass warehouses like Costco, Walmart, Sam's Club, paying with credit card, cable television. Again, he's talking about this stuff in the late 1800s. Kind of, keep in mind the historical timeline here, because that is a novel thing for somebody to speculate. But you see what Bacon was talking about in the New Atlantis and what he was prophesying. And then you see Edward Bellamy in Looking Backward talking about what America, and he argued that this was all going to come into place by the year 2000. That was his argument. Well, this book, it spreads like wildfire in America, and everybody's sort of inspired by this utopian vision of this highly technical, mechanical, united America where you don't work, right? Because he was a socialist, you have a UBI, you're given a house, you get to buy these cable television, you have a card. He specifically describes a card with numbers that you'll use to purchase items. And about 15 to 20 years later, he then comes out and he actually recounts his book looking backward, because he says what he didn't account for was that technology in the mind of Americans. Now, mind you, this is right before the 20th century. And he's lamenting the fact that I had all these socialist utopian hopes, but now I don't think they're going to come true, because I watch how Americans are so fascinated with the latest technology, whether it's beneficial to them or not. That the American mind, he's describing this in the 19th century, saying it is so focused on newly acquired technologies and gadgets that nobody cares whether it actually benefits the human person or not. And therefore, he thinks that this whole technological advancement is actually going to be problematic and is going to entrap humanity. Now, this was no Christian man, right? This is not somebody who's operating from our paradigm, but it is sort of insightful to see that that's how he feels about the American mind in the late 19th century. And then you fast forward to 2020 and you see people in sleeping bags for the new iPhone, right? And it's like, whoa, this really is something that's fixed in the American mind that people are just totally unconscious of, that we almost venerate in a religious way new technology. Now, where did that come from and why do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I always talk about this, how like the release of the first iPhone was almost like another kind of alchemical transformation of the material world. I'm old enough to remember what it was like before the iPhone came out. You know, people were conversing, strangers are just out in public on the streets, just conversing with each other. And then just like overnight, the iPhone comes out and everyone's got their head down, they're scrolling this little black mirror that everyone has in their pocket. And it was all, like, I just look at it as a phase of history where it was almost like how we, you know, what we're talking about with 1717, 1666, 1517, like these pivotal years. You have 2006 where the iPhone's released and it transforms humanity. Yeah. And like you said, and now we're not even, it's like second nature to just get these updates. I mean, the way that Apple does it is just, they're just automatically downloaded. You can't even opt out. Like you could either just not update it or, you know, you'll eventually just get suckered into updating it. But, and that's just the trajectory that everything's going in. I also mentioned like X, overnight, it just became an AI platform. You know, it just used to be microblogging, and now everyone that's interacting on X is feeding the Grok algorithm. Like it's feeding this AI, and it's like no one had an option to not do that. Like it was just transformed.
Right. And that was my argument for why Musk even bought Twitter. People thought it was for free speech.
I agree.
My point, shifting the Overton window for him was not about free speech. It's about documenting discourse globally.
I've said the same exact thing. Yeah.
It's so obvious once you see it. It's like, dude, the dude's trying to get to Mars. Like he's interested in a single, you know, what they call a type 1 civilization where everything's united. We basically have one global government. I mean, like he's explicit about all this stuff. And then he'll say something that is critical of transgenderism or, you know, AOC, and people are like, oh my God, he's my hero. Like he's totally on our side. It's like, bro, like, don't you see that us getting back to what the contemporary MAGA person would say, a more conservative America? Don't you see how that's beneficial for actually creating a transhumanist utopia? Don't you see how America regaining some type of economic dominance or there is a domestic prosperity? Don't you see how that actually advances where he's trying to go? And so it's not about free speech. It's not about political agency. It's about him taking the information and putting that into an AI, which makes his AI superior to ChatGPT. ChatGPT, you're getting all the inquiries, people are asking questions, but what are the private combos that people are having? That's what Elon Musk has. No other AI system has what Grok has because he owns X.
Yeah, I covered this when there was that whole bug with Grok where everyone was like, oh, it's based. Grok is based now. It's like talking about Mustache Man and stuff. It was praising Mustache Man, and it won over like all these like far right people who, you know, it's going to win over these people who are otherwise critical of it. And just in a moment like that, I'm really, I've been saying the same stuff. I've been really skeptical about the reasons why he bought X and turned it into this AI. I mean, there's this famous clip of him. I think it was when he was being interviewed by Jordan Peterson, and he kind of had like a mask off moment where he's like talking about this big supercomputer they're building in Arizona. And he's like, yeah, we chose Memphis because it was the capital of ancient Egypt.
Right.
And perhaps that's where our new God will come from.
Right. Yeah. And very little pushback from Peterson.
Yeah. I was just, what did you mean by that? Yeah. Like, it's like,
But exactly. He's literally, that's why he put it in Memphis, Tennessee. Like, what's going on in Memphis, Tennessee besides high crime rates? Not much. Graceland, go and see Elvis. So, Bass Pro Shop, I think, don't they have their capital?
Well, I think it's Memphis, Arizona.
Oh, it's in Memphis, Arizona.
I think so, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
Yeah, but the point is, you're right. Like the point is the name of the city. Yeah.
Right. And I want to clarify, because somebody in the chat is saying that basically I'm making things up, that Romans had engineers. My point is not that Romans didn't have architects and bridge builders and masons. Of course they did. Like, that's a dumb thing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the profession of what we describe as the engineer. There was no term like that. There was no singular profession like that until after the scientific revolution, after the founding of the Royal Societies and these scientific institutions. Of course, they were using inductive methods, or what we would call maybe, empirical approaches towards building things. And of course,
they're proto-engineers.
Profession of the engineer. I'm not talking about Romans didn't build anything. Like, that's really a dumb way to take what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, there were proto-engineers, I'd say.
And you could say now, using our concept of the engineer, that they were engineering things. Yeah, okay, fair enough. I wouldn't say you can't describe that, some Roman architect wasn't a type of engineer. Yes, but what I'm arguing is that the actual profession of the engineer is a novelty post the scientific revolution. And this isn't my opinion. This is literally something that is agreed upon by people who study the history of technology. So This isn't my theory. This is other people. Now, maybe you take umbrage with that. That's fine. But I just wanted to clarify, because that is not what I meant by it.
Yeah, and I know that you referenced in your book, it looked like you were referencing Noble often. That's the religion of technology, I think it's called, who I discovered that from Technosis, which it's interesting. Last time you had me on your podcast, and I think you recommended that book to me, and I ended up adding it to our reading list in the book club.
Technosis?
Yeah, Technosis. Yeah, Eric Davis. Yeah. Yeah, and we read it, I think earlier this year. That's a dense one, man. That's really...
He has a really good way of writing.
Yeah, he's very McLuhan-esque.
Yeah. He writes in a very interesting way. Now, he's supportive of it because, Eric Davis, he just got his PhD from Rice under Jeffrey Kripal, and he runs the GEM program, Gnosticism, Esotericism, and Mysticism PhD program. There's only a handful of PhD programs in the world where you can get a doctorate specifically in some of these Western esoteric studies. Most of them are in Europe, but Rice is the number one in the United States. And Jeffrey Kripal is the head professor that looks over that. And he wrote the famous book on Esalen. I told Jay he needed to get that book. Michael Murphy, who founded Esalen, asked Kripal to write that. Anyways, I digress. Eric Davis is the last man to interview Terence McKenna before he died. Really? Eric Davis is a fixture in the psychonaut community. And so when he's talking about technosis and technology being a resurgence of a form of Gnosticism, he's in favor of it.
Yeah.
But it's a great book because it literally, like, he's making the case for you.
Yeah, he's like saying too much almost. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, so I think the reason I brought him up was, where was I going with that? He draws a lot of these parallels with Masonry too. And like kind of going on what you were saying about these engineers, right? Like you look at the fact that we've been talking to this disembodied voice, Siri or Alexa or whatever. And now what's the next phase in that? It's to embody it, right? So it's like now it involves this kind of alchemical process of merging conceptually the spiritual alchemy with the laboratory version of alchemy, where it involves actually interacting with substances and like transmutating materials. And so I see a lot of like the direction it's heading in now is like that's the inevitable conclusion, is that you have these disembodied voices or these chatbots, and then it just makes sense that they're going to be embodied in these always in anthropomorphic form too.
Well,
And so
and look at it. Um, if you're constantly communing with the AI, as you just said, it's a disembodied voice. It has no personhood. That's like the direct inverse of prayer, right? What we're trying to do is actually contact the transcendent person, the Godhead, the Trinity. What I think the pathway. Now, I'm not saying I don't use AI. AI is a great resource for really research.
yeah, for yeah, search
You
engine.
can't
Yeah.
just trust AI though. I like I could not use AI to write my book
Yeah.
because it gets so much stuff wrong.
Yeah.
And I've seen people that get confirmation bias from the AI. However you prompt it, it will then respond in a way in which it thinks that you will like it.
Yep.
So you can literally take a topic and prompt the AI in different ways and get it to say what you want. And they could be contradictory statements. So people have to realize, one, AI is not at the point where it's like an all knowing entity. But to your point, I think there's an interesting, again, an inversion there, right? What is the Christian doing when it's trying to get some sort of transcendent or ultimate form of knowledge? We appeal back to God. We do prayer. We engage with the sacraments, this holy mystery. Well, what the transhumanists are doing, and where people who are falling into this conduit, is they're constantly communing with something that has no personhood. And then I saw an article recently where like Gen Z and younger people, teenagers, are beginning to talk like the AI because they spend so much time conversing with it that they're losing the sort of human dimension of how
Mm.
we use language. And it's like that is the process that I'm talking about that is undermining the imago Dei in man. And that is another inversion just out of many of Christianity and how people are relating to knowledge.
Yeah. And yeah, it's it's something that I'm really thankful that. Did you read that letter from Bishop Luke of Rocor? He wrote a letter about AI, about the proper. Yeah, you should really read that because it's really well researched, and he's very aware of the impact. I think he covers like 4 spiritual dangers of Orthodox Christians using AI. And that was almost one. I think he mentioned that was one of them, that people are starting to prompt these AIs for like as a spiritual father, like to get spiritual insights, and develop this kind of relationship with these chatbots that you should really have with your spiritual father. And then like another one he talks about is how it's robbing us of our ability to just be like be patient and waiting for answers for things, and seek out knowledge the traditional way, the slow way of actually going to like the library, for example, and like just reading through a bunch of books to see what you're trying to find.
Right.
Which we're being robbed of with AI because, like you said, you're just trusting that it's giving you reliable and accurate, relevant information.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're ignorant, how can you know the difference? Right.
Yeah.
The only way I can know that the AI is doing these things is because I have an actual knowledge base on certain topics. And so then I can mess around with it because I have an expertise in something and see, oh, wow, I can word something in a way where it gets it wrong. And I can word it in a way where it actually validates what I know to be true. Interesting. And, that's why when I was talking with the FDA, we were talking about how part of the problem right now of, Amazon, DoorDash is the immediate gratification. And you're literally seeing TikTok videos of kids that are 16, 17, 18 years old, and they're getting on tren and steroids. And it's like, well, why are they doing that? They want the end result of the way their body looks. And they don't want to go through the hard work of actually just being diligent and working out regularly for, a decade or so. And then you'll have the physique you want, but it's a slow process if you do it the real way. And they're crashing their testosterone levels. They're destroying their hormones at like the height of their manhood. I mean, after 24, 25, 26, your testosterone starts to go down every year. So they're totally tanking. And I'm just using that as an example to highlight the point you're making about, like, if you want to resist this stuff, like, enjoy the process. You want to learn about something, go read the books. You want to get fit, go work out. Don't take, performance enhancing drugs, especially if you're a young man. Like, have you looked at what it's going to do to your hormones down the line? And I think most people don't want to do that. And it's a form of masculinity, right? To be a man is to work on something and become proficient at it and competent. And the only way you truly become competent is to know something and do the hard work yourself. And so I think we need to celebrate people going to the library, go read the books, go read it for yourself. We were talking about philosophy the other night, and people are wondering how you get into philosophy. Go watch introductory lectures and take notes.
Yeah.
Don't prompt the
Yeah, you have
AI
to
for
actually think. Yeah, you
yes,
have to actually do you have to do the mental weightlifting
yes,
for philosophy. Like, you really have to engage with these ideas. And AI is not going to do that for you.
no, and it's not going to be inside your head. If you just prompt the AI to tell you the history of philosophy, and you got some bullet points and things, like, that's not you knowing it, and that's not really a skill. And people are confusing like the AI outputs with like their own knowledge base, and that's a that's a misnomer. Like, you got to do the work and build yourself as a man. That's the only way you get out of this.
Yeah, maybe you can go into a little bit, because I know you mentioned it early in the book, cybernetics, because that's something that kind of extends into knowledge acquisition, like this, like kind of what you're talking about, like outsourcing thinking to machines, right?
Yeah. So cybernetics, for anybody who's not familiar, is essentially the study of feedback loops, technological feedback loops that also include humans. So a very rudimentary form of cybernetic feedback loop is like a stoplight. There's a machine, it displays a symbol, and then humans engage in that symbol, and it creates a process, a feedback loop. Now, that can occur with anything. A thermostat in your house is a cybernetic feedback loop, right? Your house reaches the temperature of 72, the AC or the heat turns off. Cybernetics then is this study that got going in the mid 20th century by these, and I mentioned it, some of the famous people, John von Neumann, Gregory Bateson, Julian Bigelow. These people meet in New York in basically from 1946 to 1953, and then begin to lay out all these theories about how we're going to move into a post-biological, post-Darwinian state by utilizing our cybernetic feedback loops with technology. So essentially, you can augment, like your intelligence. There's a feedback loop with the AI. This is the promise of AI. Now, we know that AI is actually making people dumber, right? Their critical ability to think, their critical reasoning skills are actually diminishing. But the idea behind cybernetics is that you plug yourself into this growing technological system, and that these feedback loops are going to amplify on themselves. And so eventually we would reach a sort of, and that's why it's so important for transhumanism, we would reach a point of transcendence or the singularity. And John von Neumann, who's one of the founders of computer science and many different important theories regarding mathematics and computers, he's the first one to mention the singularity. Now, he doesn't use that term, the singularity, but before a year after he died, one of his friends wrote in his book a conversation he had with von Neumann, and he was saying that based on where technology is going, now mind you, this is in the 1940s, guys. He said, we are going to reach a point in which the machines and technology itself will augment itself. That's what the singularity is that the technological cybernetic system will no longer need human input for it to continue to perpetuate and advance and build itself. And so he puts this, he says he already saw this going forth in the 1940s. And then you have Werner Vinge in the 1980s actually state this thing as the singularity using Moore's law, this exponential growth of computer chips, to say, well, look, it's inevitable. Eventually, just based on the way that our technologies are developing, we're going to reach a transcendent point called the singularity. And that's where a lot of that stuff comes from. But the cybernetics, Heidegger was very critical of cybernetics. Heidegger, German phenomenologist, Das Ein, theories on being. He was very interested in trying to get back to an authentic form of being. And I use Heidegger in multiple instances in my paper because he was very critical of technology. And he saw that technology and cybernetics was essentially diminishing man to be a product that could be augmented and uploaded and upgraded. and therefore it does away with all human agency, human freedom, moral importance. And Heidegger, it's theorized that he converted to Catholicism right at the end of his life, but um, he wasn't explicitly a Christian thinker per se, but he could see that all this technology in the mid 20th century, like this is all leading toward a domination of man, so that he is no longer truly free. And he thought that this was an impetus to true being. And so he is very critical of what he called the enframing, that what technology does is where, let's say in the pre-modern period, you and I approach a river and we see the beauty of it. Maybe there's a name, maybe there's a mythology associated with the river based on the culture we come from or the area of Germany that we're from. And and our ancestors engaged with this river. But in the modern period, the mentality is you see a river and you see, oh my God, we can build a hydroelectric dam there. Think how much electricity we could build or make with the flow of that current. And so everything becomes a standing resource for something. And transhumanism, I argue, using that enframing theory of Heidegger, that humanity itself becomes a standing resource, a la the Matrix, where everybody's a battery for the machine.
Hmm. Yeah, I think as we kind of wrap up here, I wanted to mention how important it is in the way that you presented this work to demonstrate how this is all an inversion of orthodoxy.
Yes.
Because it really, someone might look at this kind of stuff and all the topics we were talking about, these figures and all this esotericism, and they might be like, that has nothing to do with with Christianity. I want nothing to do with that. And you could go your whole life, obviously, not knowing any of this stuff. These great saints, they didn't get involved in any of this, right? But I think in the modern world, and this is a lot of what I do too, and why I talk about the subjects I cover. When you understand these things in an Orthodox framework, which is the only way to understand it, through the Orthodox lens. Father Seraphim Rose talks about this too. It's the only thing that makes sense out of this.
Right.
And so when you see how it actually, in its inversion, proves the truth of orthodoxy,
Right.
it actually points to orthodoxy. Like you said, both of the other Christian traditions diverted from the Orthodox, the Orthodox phronema.
Mm-hmm.
And look at what happened. They both kind of got corrupted in their own ways. As St. Justin Popovich says, you have the papal maximalism and papal minimalism, where the Protestants are just doing this kind of form of papal minimalism where they apply it to the individual level, mm-hmm. and then the papal maximalists, they are basically just on the whatever path the Rome goes down, right? So
right.
Anyway, like this all shows that orthodoxy is the only remaining Christian tradition that has not diverted from it didn't get corrupted in the way that these other traditions did. I did find, because I was curious about this, that there was a period in the early 20th century in Russia where some of these Russian thinkers started to get interested in Kabbalah. Florensky, I think, was not synthesizing it in the way that the Renaissance, scholastics did, but he had knowledge of it. And then I found that Bulgakov did actually do some synthesis with developing his sophiology. He integrated some Kabbalah, but I was interested about that. And so it's like, that's the only thing I could find, was that there was this period in Russia where they did start to explore some esoteric ideas, but it didn't, have the impact that it did in Rome and in the Protestant Reformation as an onset of Rome. So but I just wanted to mention that, how it's really important the way you're presenting it, because I try to do the same in my work, is like to show how this is all just an inversion of the truth. Like there's
right.
You don't need to get tempted by this stuff because it just points to what's real.
Right. And to your point, I actually cite Bulgakov. And in the footnote, I highlight that he had heresies like his theology. But to your point, the reason why the Russians were already participating in this conversation in the 19th century was because of Russian cosmists.
Yeah.
And so Nikolai Fedorov, if you look
Yeah,
at his
early transhumanist.
exactly, it's a
Yeah,
proto transhumanism. And if you look at the Wikipedia, they'll say that they're Orthodox. And I found so many of these scholars that write in favor of transhumanism cite him as saying that the Orthodox Christian theosis doctrine is the same thing as transhumanism. Look at Nikolai Fedorov and look what he said. And so he was interested in like ancestral worship. He was interested. He believed that we're going to resurrect the dead through technology, that we're going to move, fuse with technology and have a sort of immortality and omniscience. And so he
yeah.
was
He's
a
doing
sort of
body modifications too.
body modification.
Yeah,
Yes, he was in, and I have a book all about, and they try to present it as like, look how Russian cosmists and transhumanism goes together. Like arguing that there's like space for Orthodox dialogue into all this stuff. But yeah, Bulgakov, what I used and what I found useful from him is he creates the delineation between God manhood and man godhood, and that's the title of chapter 4 is transfiguration, God manhood or man godhood. Transfiguration meaning which direction is man moving towards. Man godhood, obviously the apotheosis of transhumanism, man moving into godhood, where Bulgakov makes clear in one of his books that I make reference to in the footnotes, that he was arguing that orthodoxy is the religion of God manhood. This is something he actually got right, and I don't recommend anybody diving into Bulgakov
yeah,
unless you're already rooted in your orthodoxy and like what's real and what's not and what we believe. Do not read Sergei Bulgakov.
yeah.
He's
There's like a
very
thousand things you should be reading before Bulgakov.
yeah.
Yeah,
Bulgakov is not something that any Orthodox inquirer, catechumen, or
yeah.
newly illuminated should be reading. However, he was a Russian Orthodox theologian that fled Russia into Paris and was part of a lot of those Parisian Orthodox theologians that were taking residence there. But he came up with weird ideas. But my point is, this delineation between God manhood and man godhood is picked up by um, Brandon Gallagher, who I'm told is an Orthodox priest. I would love to have him on my show. I've never spoke with him, but he's a philosopher, and he actually has an article in Transhumanism and its critics. I have a book that is both people that are for transhumanism and against transhumanism, but it's all the different religious traditions, like Lincoln Cannon, the Mormon. He's in there arguing for it. But Brandon Gallagher has the only Eastern Orthodox article in that book, and it begins by saying transhumanism is satanic. And I quote him at, I think, at the beginning of my book, or maybe the beginning of chapter 4 anyway. And so he's utilizing Bulgakov's framework to delineate between these two processes. And it's really important because the Christian Transhumanist Association out of Tennessee, they are constantly trying to co-opt Orthodox theology, Orthodox theological terms, our Orthodox saints. They use St. Maximus Confessor to legitimate transhumanism.
Wow.
And the whole premise of the Christian transhumanist movement is that the Eastern Orthodox concept of theosis is coming to fruition through transhumanism. But again, if you're going to be serious about this stuff and look at the paradigms, they're totally different paradigms. One is man becoming God, apotheosis. One is the God man himself building the bridge that we all then try to become like Christ so that we can cross from temporal existence into eternity. And these are totally different worldviews, totally different systems. I highlight that, whether it be the effective altruism of Sam Altman or some of these other transhumanists, like their entire ethics is utilitarian, where the Orthodox Church is a therapeutic ethic. We actually believe that if you do the right thing, God's energies begin to heal you. Like there's a true mystery that's happening. So for our paradigm as Orthodox Christians, morality isn't some legalistic juridical framework. That's the reason why we call the church the hospital. It is literally a healing process through a mystery. And so we have a therapeutic ethic. Anyways, I'm just highlighting that these two paradigms are actually, and I go through all of chapter 4 as highlighting how they're inversions of each other. And I found a book that I really appreciate towards the end of my research by Umberto Eco, talking about programming language. And this is early within programming language. I think this is in the 1990s he wrote this book, but he's talking about how the attempts for coding languages is inspired by rebuilding a primordial language, a la the Tower of Babel, right? This is Umberto Eco. He's not Christian, and he's certainly not coming from a Orthodox perspective, but he's highlighting, look at like what these computer programmers are doing, the languages that they're building. They explicitly state that the purpose of this is to create a universal language, a la the Tower of Babel, that can unite humanity back into sort of an authoritative system, a la, again, the Tower of Babel. It's the same thing playing itself out. And computer languages, ones and zeros, really is the new universal language that is trying to get all of us brought into this sort of technocratic domination.
Yeah, I mean, you see this with the. It's especially prominent with the Christian Kabbalist. This esoteric notion that Hebrew is a divine language that
Yes.
possesses this like mystical power to unlock the gates of Eden. You know,
Right.
they're tying into your theme of, like trying to return to this. Well, that's especially present in Kabbalism, or they're
Yes.
trying to restore Eden, and they believe that these words of power they're like magical tools that are imbued with divine energy that manipulates reality itself. That this is why they have like an actual like abstinence of speaking certain, like the divine name. So they'll actually abstain from saying certain words.
Yes.
And then they believe that certain words also have power. So this is, where they started using the tetragrammaton to define the Trinity and stuff like that. That's like a very important concept to understand. All of this is that they believe that these words actually have power. You see this in the Marxist dialectic with the censorship of certain language and emphasizing certain words that have this seemingly mystical power. You drop an N-bomb and it's like you can actually reshape your reality, like stuff like that.
Right.
But anyway, I wanted to get, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, that's exactly what I was highlighting with this sort of magical understanding. And they really do view programming language as a form of magic. And many of the companies, and I highlight this in the book, and it's blanking me on all the different examples, but they utilize frameworks that refer to magic, the use of magic wands, demons, daemons, stuff like this is very common within computer language and the way that they frame it. So, I try to delineate these two things in the various ways in which I demonstrate that these are inversions of each other. Is one, the process, man godhood versus God manhood. So totally different processes of deification. Second one is the mind versus the soul. So transhumanism totally allocates your identity to your mind. They build this off a theory of mind called functionalism, meaning that if your brain can do 2 + 2 = 4, a calculator can do 2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, it's functionally equivalent. As long as the output is put out the same and it's correct, it's functionally equivalent. Now, this is a controversial theory in the philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind has never dealt with the hard problem of consciousness since the 1980s. It's basically stagnant. And so the entire transhumanist movement is built on a theory that, one, isn't even verifiable. You cannot prove the functionalist definition of mind. And so they believe that mind is an emergent property, and that if they can do a full brain scan of your brain, therefore that is who you are. The mind, or the sense of self, is an emergent property, that then they can put that into code. And that is what they mean by uploading you into a computer, is that it's a map of your synapses. And they think that they can like hold your memories and all types of stuff in the machine. So I highlight that is very different from the soul. So the anthropological focus between transhumanism and theosis is different regarding the soul versus the mind. And then I highlight the metaphysics, theosis versus henosis. Theosis is both and, as we already spoke about, and henosis is monistic. And it's all about a merger with the material for them. So it basically takes Neoplatonism and Neoplatonic theurgy, meaning that you conduct a ritual to transcend to the next level. And that's what the technologies they're building are, in a sense, rituals that they think they're transcending to the next level. Difference is they're not Neoplatonic in a metaphysical sense where they're focused on abstract universals and the one. It's in the materialistic sense, but the trajectory is in the same. And then I highlight that within the moment we exist right now, the quote unquote meaning crisis, you hear Paggio, Vervaeke, Peterson, so many of these guys talking about the meaning crisis, the meaning crisis. And so I highlight in that section of the last chapter that we do exist in a meaning crisis, and that nihilism and universal narratives and the sacred canopy that unites all of us, that has collapsed. And so everybody is now searching for meaning. And that's why I argue that the return to Babylon, the final battle, truly is between concepts of deification, because deification is the ultimate answer to the meaning crisis. And you can find this multiple people that are finding meaning in transhumanism, that maybe they're nihilistic, they don't have a meaning for life, but now they're inspired that maybe they can live forever, and they can fuse with the machine. And so in a post-secular framework where the meaning crisis and people are trying to construct meaning out of nowhere, you really have the pre-modern option of orthodoxy, or you have the endpoint of the modernist project in transhumanism. And that modern, pre-modern delineation, I think, it's kind of theoretical, but I think it's really important, because postmodernism is reacting to modernity, saying, look, you guys do not value subjective experience, which is true. And the postmodernists are saying, look, based on your own empirical projects, 19th century empiricism, logical positivism, phenomenology, and existentialism, you guys actually have disproved any sort of universal foundation for knowledge. Now, I'm not a postmodernist, but their critiques of modernity are correct. Where they end is like, there are no universals. You construct your own truth. Men can be women and all this different stuff. So it's way out of bounds in their conclusions, but their critiques are right. And so Christos Giannaros, which is a Orthodox theologian that I reference multiple times in the Orthodox section and also in the 4th chapter, he argues that the postmodern turn is actually an opportunity for orthodoxy in the West, because he's saying, look, what the postmodernists are saying about the modernist project, which is everything that we've talked about, all this history leading up to the present moment, is can be fulfilled and then moved forward through orthodoxy. So we value subjective experience. And because of theosis, personal faith in your relationship with Christ, which is individual, totally subjective, right? I do not know your relationship with Christ and the Godhead. That is actually at the beginning of our pyramid of knowledge. So we agree with the postmodernists in the sense that there needs to be a revivifying dimension to subjective personal experience. That's where we get personal faith in our relationship with God. But from there, orthodoxy is the only thing that maintains our traditional metaphysics. And so postmodernism does away with all metaphysics, all truth claims, all morality. Orthodoxy, and the only thing the postmodernists offer is more subjective experience as a validating form of knowledge. Orthodoxy says, yeah, subjective experience can be a form of knowledge. In fact, in your relationship with God, that is the principal point. But rationality, science, metaphysics, all this stuff is also important, but it's incorporated within our total hierarchy, paradigmatic hierarchy. And so my argument is that you basically, like the average person, not that they're thinking of this consciously, but you have essentially 3 paths to face the crisis facing man right now. You can flee into postmodernity, where everything is relative. You can continue on the modernist project, which transhumanism is its endpoint, or you can try to revert back to something that's pre-modern before the Renaissance. And I think that's why like a lot of the wingnats are into paganism. I think that's why trad Catholicism is becoming important. And I think that's why we're getting so many converts into orthodoxy. But it's happening at a subconscious level. People aren't thinking, oh my God, the modernity is collapsing. I'm feeling the existential angst. Which direction do I go? They're like, gosh, I need tradition. I need identity. I need mystery. I need something transcendent. All those things are going to be found in a pre-modern worldview because modernity has erased them. And so in that context, I truly believe that moving forward for the next 20, 30, 40 years, I think we're going to see Orthodoxy continue to grow in the West and around the world. And I think transhumanism is going to continue to grow, and that they really are in competition of each other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That was very well said. So yeah, all right. I want to let's wrap things
Yeah.
up here. I
Yeah.
just
Go
have a
ahead.
couple. Let me see if there's okay. We got one super chat here from Alan. Thank you, based Alan Wong, with another $10. The cross is the framework that will take us to heaven. Amen, brother. Yeah, that's so true. And then there was a. Let me see that. I thought I saw a question over on Substack. We're also streaming to Substack. If you
Oh,
guys are over there,
shout out to the Substack.
yeah. Shout out to you guys. I'm sorry I haven't been really keeping up there. Lane Jackson asked, I just joined. Are we Orthodox against things like cybernetic limbs?
Cybernetic lens. What do they mean by
I
that?
think probably artificial limbs, I would assume. I don't know about the
Oh,
cybernetic part.
I thought you said lens like a glasses.
Limbs, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
limbs. Oh,
Like
okay.
prosthetics, yeah.
Well, this is what I mentioned with. Um, I've mentioned this previously in my stream, and this is why the church needs to catch up. Right, we have very few clerics that are speaking directly to transhumanism. Father Josiah Trenum has done some. Father Peter Heers has written articles about it, and I'm blanking on some of the hierarchs that I grabbed in chapter 4. Metropolitan Nafpatkos speaks about it explicitly. Patriarch Krill talks about the problems of technology and transhumanism and Russia. But I think the church needs to become more explicit on where the line is. When I was on with Father John Valadez of Death to the World, I brought this up to him is like, what is the church's teaching to an Orthodox Christian man who owns a plumbing business? And that by 2030, as even the US government and some of these corporations expect, we're going to have a digital currency. Um, like if they have to get registered because the only way that their business can move forward is if they get a digital currency, are they condemned? Where is eventually? I do believe there's going to be an explicit mark, whether it be an RFID chip or some type of electronic tattoo. Eventually, like that's the clear line. But there's going to be so many lines. Like where is the battle? Where's the line that you're not going to cross? And I think the church needs to give some type of pastoral advice for people. Now, if, for example, is a pacemaker transhuman? Well, in a sense, but if my parent has a massive heart attack and needs a pacemaker to exist, am I going to say, "Oh gosh, I'm an Orthodox Christian, I don't want them to live. Let's not do the pacemaker." I don't know. I don't know where the line is. And when you're talking about sort of um, cyborg limbs and stuff, yeah, if you go to war and you get your legs taken off, are you, nullifying your Christian faith because you have artificial limbs? I don't think so. I think this is why it's so tricky. And just like Neuralink is healing the paraplegics and giving sight to the blind, well, interestingly enough, that's what Christ did. And the machines are now doing this. Now, if your child is born blind and there's a new procedure in which they're able to see, do you do it or not? I don't know what that answer is, and that's why the church and our hierarchs need to speak to this. And the only one that I'm seeing really hit this dead on is Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu over in Cyprus. Is he's talked a lot about the prophecies and the wars and the New World Order and the Khazars and all this different stuff going on in our world. But we need more voices, and we need, the church right now is struggling because we're getting so many young people in the church. We don't even have enough clerics. So how can and I get their situation. So I'm like demanding, hey guys, we need hierarchs and bishops to talk about like where the line is. How do us Orthodox Christians deal with the transformation of our world right now? And at the same time, they're like, dude, I can't even get a break because I have so many services and our church is so full. I have 32 catechumens. What do you want me to do? Like, I don't have time to do that. And so I get it. The church is in a difficult position, but we need to ask for our hierarchs to take this seriously and speak to the faithful on where exactly we should go. Now, for me personally, I have my own hard lines. I'm not getting brain chips. I'm not getting augmented. Now, the transhumanist would say, well, do you wear glasses? Yeah, I have glasses. Do you have contacts? Yeah. Oh, well, those are technology. You're already transhuman. Do you have a smartphone? You're already transhuman. It's like, look, I'm not going to play that game. I get it that the phone, like if you scroll, it already augments your brain that day. You're going to have a difficult time focusing on something for long periods. It's affecting your brain in real time. Does that make you transhuman? No, no.
Yeah, we
And
don't
so
need
the
to get
transhumanists try
Talmudic
to say
about
you
it.
are. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just said we don't need to get Talmudic about it. Like,
Yeah,
like drawing these like really clear, like having these endless debates over it. Yeah, I
exactly.
think exactly what you just said. Like we just need more clerical insight on this. I'm very thankful, like I said, that Bishop Luke issued that letter about AI. It was
Is that recent?
yeah, it was a couple months ago. I covered it on one of my
Oh,
streams
that's why
on
I haven't read it.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think I covered it on a stream I did on. It was about this this trend of what what's being called digital necromancy, like the like what we saw with Charlie Kirk, like how the
Right,
Protestants are, digitally reviving these figures
right.
to
Through
communicate
AI.
with them. Yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, and it came out like just in time for that, and so I read that on the
Yeah, I
stream.
have
But
to read.
yeah,
That's why I hadn't read it yet. Because when you said, Father Luke put out this thing on transhuman, I'm thinking, what? I
yeah,
searched the internet for like a week trying to find everything I could find, whether it be
yeah,
in Greek or Russian, on Orthodoxy speaking about transhumanism, and I incorporated much of what I found in that chapter 4. So when you said that, I was like, oh no, did I miss something? But you said it was 2 months ago.
yeah. It was
So
pretty
that makes
recent.
sense why I didn't have it in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we want it to be like that, where there's like, oh, I wish I could have put this in my book, like we hope that there's going to be more Orthodox clerics speaking to this to the point where maybe you have to write a follow up to the book to include more
Yeah.
of their quotes, like that's our hope. So yeah,
I
that's
thought about doing a follow up that's easier for the average person, because you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about you writing your book and trying to deal with the fact that a lot of people may not know all the Kabbalistic terminology you refer to. And as an author, you only have so much space and you
yeah,
can't explain every single thing.
yeah,
And so, like for my book, I just said, okay, it may not be a mass reader, it's not going to be a bestseller, but I want to put out one thing at least. And the next few book projects I have are going to be much more easily accessible to the average person. But I wanted to put out something that was academic. Now, obviously, it was my dissertation, and I could have kind of rewritten it where it was easier. But I was like, no, I want it to be for the person who really wants this type of information. Like, here it is. I'm not going to explain I explain quite a bit. Like, I bring up somebody and I'll say like why they're important, their dates. But there's a lot. I put a lot on the reader.
yeah,
And that's what in academia, I mean, you're expecting the person that is reading it already is kind of up to
yeah,
speed on things.
exactly,
And that's why
yeah,
Marshall McLuhan is so difficult to read, because he gives you no break.
yeah,
He
yeah,
expects that you've already read everything in Western civilization.
yeah. That's true. Yeah, so I mean, I highly recommend this book. I only read, a fraction of it, the first chapter, I would say, which is a good 100-page chapter. But I can approve of the research being very thorough, just based on what I've been researching the past 2 years. I know that you've been researching this for quite some time as well, probably way longer than I have.
Well, the
So
beginning of this book project was 2.5 years ago.
wow, yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds about right. Yeah, I mean, and I'm sure you experienced the same thing I am, which is like you think you have enough material, and then the further you get into it, you realize like there's like another mountain of research to go through and comb through and figure out how to integrate it into your thesis. So
Right.
it's seemingly endless.
Yeah. And as an
So
author, I'm sure you feel the same ways. You want it to be relevant in 10 years.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Like a lot of people write books that are just no longer relevant. I mean,
yeah.
go
They're
read
referencing
a
these trends and
Steven
stuff.
Pinker book.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
is it relevant in 20 is Sam Harris's like books, are they
yeah,
important? No, they're totally irrelevant now. They were maybe interesting beginning of 20, the 20 teens or the early 2000s, but I wanted something that you could read. That's why I tried to make not a whole lot of references to the contemporary period. I even had to change the intro because I mentioned that Elon Musk was like a huge supporter of Trump. And by the time I went to publish it, there was already a fallout between
Oh
Trump and
yeah,
Elon. I
yeah,
was like, oh yeah, I got to rewrite that.
yeah,
And it's like, that's why I tried to stay away from a lot of immediate references, because that's the only way you can make it a little bit more timeless, because things are going to change. The dynamic between Musk and Trump went from buddy buddy during this process to now I'm ready to publish it in like 2 months. Before I'm ready to publish it, it's like they have a huge fallout. I'm like, oh, now my intro looks totally retarded.
yeah,
And so that's one of the difficult points about being an author and writing a book, is like, you want to put everything in there so you don't miss anything. But then you put everything in there, then you have to explain everything depending on who your expected reader is. And at the same time, you want it to be relevant in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, it's really difficult to write a book that is relevant in 20 years.
yeah. Yeah. You have to really be always thinking about, is this timeless? Is this timeless information that is, is it going to become more relevant? I mean, I don't even know how these authors like McLuhan, for example, that you mentioned, how they went about writing these works where they end up becoming timeless. It's like, did they anticipate
going through McLuhan again? I got these.
Oh yeah, that's a good, yeah.
Gutenberg Galaxy.
Yeah.
But yeah,
you see these themes of like it's like they seem like they're, they called McLuhan the prophet of the electric age or
right.
whatever. And it's like, he wasn't thinking of himself that way. It's like, it's a lot like these technocrats that they can kind of see the trajectory of technological advancement like 10, 20 years down the road. Or even, like we were mentioning Eric Davis. It's like that work was written in the 90s and it seems prophetic, but it's like, these guys just have their finger on the pulse of where things are headed because they're at the forefront of the innovations. So like, they know exactly where it's going. But yeah, so I want to thank you, DPH, for your time here. If anyone has any like last second questions or comments you want to get in, the best way to do that will be super chat. And the best way to support my work is always going to be Substack for $9 a month, because you get a lot in return. So instead of just a donation that appears on the stream, you actually get a whole 3-year archive of material that I've been covering over on Substack. You get access to the book club where, next year I'll be releasing the list soon for our readings, but next year, DPH's book will definitely be on there. So I'd love to have you back to,
I would love that, dude. I'd love to speak with people that read the book.
Yeah.
I told you, you're the first person I've spoke to that has read it outside of the 7 people. Only 7 people read my book before I published it. So I didn't have a whole lot of feedback, other than my dissertation committee. They gave me, those were all, but they're non-Orthodox. Not, I mean, these are like professional professors. So it's a different conversation. I want like Orthodox Christians, like guys like us that are like seekers and presenters and have our finger on the pulse of contemporary culture, like what they think of what they get from, because it's one of the difficult things, as you know, as a writer, is like how people receive what you're writing. And you can think you're saying something and somebody views it totally different.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I want to hear what people get from it. And so, if you're able to do a book club meeting on it, I would love to come in and talk with people.
Yeah, I'd love to have, that's part of the reason I try to select works that are written by people like within our circle. Because I like to have the authors come on, and then, how often do you get a chance to actually have a discussion with the author of a book that you read, like I think that's a pretty cool opportunity. So yeah, we'd love to have you. I don't know which month I have it planned for, but
sure. Just let me know. We can play it by ear.
Yeah. I had Eschaton. I had Jonathan from Eschaton Vigil join us. We read the eschatological.
Did you see the new one that just came out? I got it this weekend.
Yeah, I was talking to him as he was getting ready to publish it. Yeah, it's like 700 pages now.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
The first one, the Eschatological Visions of the Blessed, is like this big.
Yeah,
it's the first
like
one he published.
Yeah.
And this thing is so thorough. I mean, every saint you can think of, like, he has their prophecies. I mean, it's just a crap ton of
Does
saints.
he do more citations in that one? Because the first one, oh, that's good. Yeah, the first one was like kind of lacking and I don't particularly care about that, but a lot of people question these prophecies. So
right. No, it's all cited.
Nice.
That's why it took so long for him to do is, I think he cited basically everything that he grabbed. Is he cited the primary source, whether it be Serbian, Romanian, Greek, or Russian, um, and then put that in the footnote. So you could, it difficult. They're difficult. I mean, it takes. I appreciate what he did with this
Yeah.
book because I know how long it takes to do
Oh yeah.
research and to do it in so many different languages and such obscure sources. Like some of these prophecies, there's like only one piece that even has it, and you got to go hunt it down and find it. So he's one of the unique people that was able to put all that stuff together. So I told him today, I was like, man, this is incredible. This is like the ultimate compendium. If you want to see what saints have said about the end times, I'm going to do a stream on this book later this week, but this is kind of the ultimate one.
Yeah.
You know, there's Russia before the second coming, and there's Elders on the End Times. That's a Romanian one. Russia before the second coming is the famous eschatological text out of Russia. But this is unique. This is the only thing, and it's all in English, that is all the prophecies of saints regarding the Antichrist, the end times, the Great Confusion, the Great World War, all this different stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, do support the Eschaton Vigil. You know, my brother does a lot of work trying to put that stuff together, and I totally respect it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a lot of work to go through all that stuff and cite it. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you again for thank you everyone who's tuned in and, you know, paid any of your attention to this conversation as things get, you know, increasingly more difficult to focus in the digital age, to focus your attention on something for more than 10 minutes.
Yeah. Stop scrolling.
Yeah. Stop scrolling. I commend you guys if you were able to follow along with this kind of conversation. If you, you know, do want to engage more with this kind of material, definitely go check out Return to Babylon. Join the book club because that's what we're after. And the book club is tuning out the noise and doing more, you know, slow kind of research and reading and contemplation, writing, you know, collaborating with sharing our ideas and our thoughts together. And, you know, just becoming more disciplined in how we attain knowledge in the digital age. So, yeah, do that. Go by Return to Babylon. And any last thoughts you want to share here?
No, man, I appreciate you having me on. You're the first person to do a stream with me talking about my book. I have one set up with Jay. When I go to the conference in Florida, we're going to do a live stream at his house. So it'll be an in-person interview. Going over my book, but you're the first one to reach out to me, man. I truly appreciate your support and even getting my book and reading it and allowing me to come on here and talk about it. Really means a lot. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to write a book. And there's not a whole lot of reward for it. It's not a very lucrative thing to do.
Yeah.
It's more about trying to do something of importance that will stand time. At least that's how I approach it. It's like, I want something that, you know, I'm proud that my name's attached to. But I never thought it was going to make a lot of money, and very difficult to make a lot to make from a book.
Yeah. The time and money trade-off is not very equal. You're working, like the amount of time you're spending writing and researching, you're making maybe like $1 an hour for like the amount of profits you're going to make for the book when it's published. Yeah. But you know, over time, you know, that's why you have incentive to actually write timeless works, because you know, that'll just keep selling. Hopefully, as time goes on, it won't like kind of diminish with the trends. So, I hope that, you know, like you said, as orthodoxy is growing along kind of parallel with the transhumanist movement, I think that this kind of work will become increasingly more important. So that's what I hope. But,
well, thank you, brother. I appreciate it. And if anybody wants, if you don't know who I am, you can find me over at the YouTube channel Church of the Eternal Logos, the YouTube channel Dr. David Patrick Harry. And if you are interested in joining our community, we have a men's only community over at school.com called the Logos Academy, where we discuss philosophy, theology, and kind of masculine development, fitness, health, all that type of stuff. It's a men's only community. So if, unfortunately, ladies, many ladies have wanted to join because of the resources, all my study guides, all my private videos, members videos, private Q&As, private think tank discussions on various topics. All that stuff is over there. It is only for men though, because I think when women get men's only spaces are rare, And I truly appreciate the conversations you can have when you're in a group with men of like interest in the ideas that emerge. So if you're interested in finding an Orthodox Christian community of men that are serious about talking about stuff like Anthony and I just talked about, you can check me out at school.com/Logos Academy. And that's it. So thank you for very
Nice.
much for having me on. If this conversation was of interest, check out Return to Babylon from Adam to Antichrist. I'd be greatly appreciative.
All right. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate all of you, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.
God bless.